Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The ritual. Have you ever wondered what lies beyond the veil between our world and the next? I have. And now, 6 months after that fateful night, as I feel it growing inside me, I wish I had never tried to find out. My name is Tris Mitchell, and I'm writing this from a small motel room just outside of Salem, Massachusetts. The irony of my location isn't lost on me. This town, with its dark history of witch trials, seems fitting for someone like me, someone who dabbled in forces they didn't understand and is now paying the ultimate price. It started on a cold April evening. I had just moved into my grandmother's old Victorian house in Bridgewater after her passing. The house itself was a treasure trove of occult items, crystals, tarot cards, and ancient books written in languages I couldn't comprehend. My grandmother had always been considered the local wise woman, though she preferred the term spiritual consultant. Growing up, I'd watch her perform readings for desperate housewives and troubled teens, never really believing in any of it myself. But that changed when I found her journal hidden behind a loose panel in the library. The leather-bound book contained detailed instructions for various rituals, including one that caught my eye, a ceremony to communicate with soldiers lost in battle. My grandmother had apparently developed it during World War II to help families find closure with their lost loved ones. The ritual seemed simple enough: a circle of black candles, a mirror placed at a specific angle to catch the moonlight, and a few drops of my blood. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Everything could go wrong. I chose to perform the ritual on the night of a new moon, just as the journal suggested. The house was silent except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of century-old floorboards. I arranged everything exactly as described: 13 black candles in a perfect circle, the antique floor-length mirror positioned to face north, and my grandmother's silver ritual knife, clean and gleaming in the candlelight. As I pricked my finger and let 3 drops of blood fall onto the mirror's surface, I thought about all the soldiers who had died in various conflicts. I hadn't expected anyone specific to answer my call. I was doing this more out of curiosity than anything else. That's what I tell myself now, anyway. Maybe if I keep repeating it, I'll eventually believe it. The candle flames flickered in unison, though there was no breeze. The temperature in the room dropped so dramatically that I could see my breath forming little clouds in the air. The mirror's surface began to ripple like disturbed water, and that's when I first saw him, Kirk. He appeared gradually, like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. A young man in a World War I uniform, couldn't have been older than 22. His face was handsome but haunted, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold centuries of pain. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder, both there and not there at the same time. "You shouldn't have called," were his first words to me. "But now that you have, I need your help. They're coming for me again, and you're my only chance." I should have ended it right there. I should have broken the circle and sent him back to whatever realm he came from. But there was something in those eyes, a desperate plea that touched something deep within my soul. So I listened as he began to tell his story, unaware that every word was another thread in an elaborate web, and I was the willing fly walking right into it. Little did I know that this encounter would lead me down a path of no return, where the lines between reality and nightmare would blur, and where ancient forces would use my compassion as a weapon against my very soul. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly how it happened, every terrifying detail, while I still have enough of my sanity left to remember it all. And maybe, just maybe, by sharing this story, I can warn others about the dangers of reaching across the veil. Because sometimes, when you call into the darkness, something answers. And sometimes, that something has been waiting for centuries for someone just like you to make that call. Kirk's reflection in the mirror grew stronger as he began his story, his uniform becoming more distinct. I could make out the patches of the 26th Infantry Division, known as the Yankee Division. His eyes seemed to look past me, focused on horrors I couldn't see. It was 1918, near Helloween in France, he began, his voice carrying the weight of a century's worth of trauma. We were part of a small reconnaissance unit, just 8 of us. The German lines had been quiet, too quiet. We should have known something was wrong. As he spoke, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Frost began forming on the mirror's edges, creating intricate patterns that looked suspiciously like ancient symbols. I pulled my grandmother's shawl tighter around my shoulders, fighting the urge to break the circle and run. We walked right into their trap. But they weren't normal soldiers. Kirk's voice cracked. Their eyes, black as pitch. When they spoke, their voices echoed like they were coming from the bottom of a well. They didn't want prisoners, they wanted vessels. The candles flickered violently, and for a moment, I thought I saw other faces in the mirror behind Kirk, twisted, shadowy figures with eyes like burning coals. I blinked, and they were gone. Their leader called himself Nefarious. Kirk continued, his hands trembling as he reached up to adjust his collar. He didn't wear a uniform, just black robes with red symbols that seemed to move on their own. He knew things about all of us that no enemy could possibly know. But what he knew about me... Kirk's voice trailed off, and I watched as a single tear rolled down his ethereal cheek. The mirror's surface rippled again, and suddenly I was seeing what he was remembering, a suburban home in Boston, circa 1908. 2 young boys playing in their father's study. The older one, maybe 12, showing his younger brother their father's revolver, believing it wasn't loaded. I had buried that memory so deep, Kirk whispered. The day I accidentally killed my brother Tommy. My mind locked it away, but Nefarious, he pulled it out of me like a splinter from a festering wound. He showed me everything, Tommy's face when the gun went off, the way he fell, how the carpet turned red around him. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The images in the mirror kept changing, the horror of that childhood tragedy morphing into scenes from the war, then into something else entirely, dark ritual chambers where Nefarious and his demon-possessed soldiers worked their terrible magic on their captives. They didn't just want to break our bodies, Kirk explained, his voice growing harder. They wanted to break our souls. Nefarious would spend hours telling us about humanity's future, wars that would never end, how people would become their own demons. He spoke of a time when evil would hide in plain sight, when people would willingly mark their bodies with Lucifer's sigils and call it art, when they would sacrifice their children on the altar of progress and call it choice. The candles suddenly burned blue, and I felt a presence behind me, something ancient and cold. But when I turned to look, there was only darkness. He broke me, Triss, Kirk admitted, shame evident in his voice. After weeks of torture, after having my deepest guilt exposed and exploited, after watching my fellow soldiers either die or become vessels for Legion, I gave in. I let them in. And the moment I did, I felt his embrace, Lucifer's embrace. It was like being wrapped in wings made of ice and fire. A sharp pain shot through my temples, and for a split second, I thought I saw massive wings unfurling behind Kirk's reflection. The room filled with the scent of sulfur and burning roses. "But you can help me," Kirk pleaded, pressing his hands against the mirror's surface from his side. "You can cleanse my soul, hide me from their sight. All you have to do is invite me in, shelter my spirit within yours. Please, Triss. They're coming for me again. I can feel them searching." The candlelight dimmed, and shadows began creeping up the walls like living things. Kirk's face became desperate, his eyes wide with terror. "Please," he begged. "I don't have much time. Will you help me? Will you accept me?" Looking back now, I wonder if there was ever really a choice. The way he looked at me, the pure desperation in his voice, the horror of his story, it all worked together to bypass my rational mind and speak directly to my heart. And so, like a fool rushing in where angels fear to tread, I said the words that would change my life forever. "Yes, Kirk. I accept you. Come to me." The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the triumphant smile that flashed across his face, a smile that, just for a moment, seemed far too wide for a human mouth, filled with teeth that gleamed like shards of broken mirrors. I've always heard that drowning is like falling asleep. What they don't tell you is that falling into darkness can feel like drowning too. After I accepted Kirk's spirit, I plunged into a void so profound that even screaming felt impossible. But what awaited me in that darkness was far worse than simple oblivion. The dreams began immediately. No, to call them dreams would be like calling a hurricane a light breeze. They were experiences, revelations, memories that weren't my own, all tangled together in a tapestry of horror and ecstasy. In the first dream, I found myself lying on what felt like silk sheets in a massive four-poster bed. The room around me was illuminated by thousands of floating candles, their flames casting dancing shadows on walls that seemed to breathe. That's when I felt him, the weight of another body pressing against mine, the brush of feathers against my skin. He was beautiful, this angel. His face was perfection itself, carved from divine light and shadow. 6 wings wrapped around us both, creating a cocoon of softened darkness. His touch was electric, sending waves of pleasure and pain through my entire being. I felt loved, cherished, chosen. "My precious vessel," he whispered, his voice like honey poured over broken glass. "You've done so well, bringing him to us. Bringing yourself to us." It wasn't until I saw his wings in the candlelight that my euphoria began to crack. They were broken, twisted things, bleeding a substance that looked like liquid starlight. Where they touched my skin, they left marks, intricate patterns that burned and froze simultaneously. "You're not." I tried to speak, but his finger pressed against my lips. "SHHHH," he soothed. "Names have power, dear Triss. You don't need to speak mine. You already were my mark." I looked down at my body and screamed. My skin was covered in symbols that glowed with an internal fire, the same symbols I had seen in Kirk's memories, the ones that decorated Nefarious' robes. The angel, no, not an angel, laughed, and the sound was like crystal bells shattering. "Did you really think Kirk needed saving? He was our messenger, our key to you. We've been watching you since you were born, Triss Mitchell. Your grandmother's powers, her knowledge, they were meant to lead you here, to this moment." The room began to spin, the candles whirling like a tornado of fire. His wings tightened around me, and I felt something inside me change, shift, awaken. A life force that wasn't my own, pulsing with ancient power. "Our child will be beautiful," he whispered as everything faded to black. A bridge between worlds, born of choice and deception. The perfect vessel. I woke up on the floor of my grandmother's library, the mirror shattered into exactly 13 pieces, each reflecting a different phase of the moon. The candles had burned down completely, leaving perfect circles of black wax on the hardwood floor. When I looked at my phone, I discovered that 3 days had passed. But the true horror wasn't the lost time or the destroyed ritual space. It was what I found when I finally managed to drag myself to the bathroom mirror. My eyes, something about them had changed. In certain lights, they seemed to reflect colors that don't exist in nature. And there, just visible beneath my skin, were faint lines forming patterns that looked suspiciously like the beginning of wings. I spent the next week in a fever dream, barely able to distinguish reality from hallucination. The house itself seemed to pulse with new energy. Books would fall from shelves, their pages opening to passages about Nephilim and fallen angels. My grandmother's crystals would vibrate and shatter for no apparent reason. And every mirror in the house had to be covered because I kept seeing faces in them, hundreds of faces, all with Kirk's features twisted into expressions of agony or ecstasy. But worst of all were the birds. Every morning, I'd wake to find hundreds of dead ravens scattered across my front lawn, their bodies arranged in perfect geometric patterns. The neighbors never seemed to notice them, and by sunset, they would always be gone, not a single feather left behind to prove they had ever been there. It wasn't until the second week that I noticed the first physical changes. My hair began growing at an impossible rate, turning a shade of black so deep it seemed to absorb light. My skin became hypersensitive to sunlight, and I could swear that sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I could see shadows moving independently of my body. And then there were the whispers, constant, seductive whispers in languages I shouldn't understand but somehow did. They spoke of power, of destiny, of a child that would bridge the gap between heaven and hell. A child that was already growing inside me, conceived in a dream that wasn't a dream at all. As I write this from my motel room, watching the neon vacancy sign flicker through the rain-streaked window, I can feel it moving inside me. 4 months into this nightmare pregnancy, and nothing is normal. The local clinic in Salem merely called the police when they saw my ultrasound. I don't blame them, what they saw couldn't possibly be human. But I should back up. Tell you about the day I found my grandmother's true journal, hidden inside a hollow space beneath her grave. Yes, you read that correctly. 2 weeks after my encounter, I was drawn to the cemetery by dreams so vivid they left physical bruises on my skin. Using my bare hands, I dug through the earth like a woman possessed until I found a sealed metal box. The journal inside was different from the one that had led me to perform the ritual. This one was bound in something that felt uncomfortably like human skin, its pages written in multiple languages, some of which seemed to move when I tried to focus on them. But I could read it. God help me, I could read every word. My grandmother wasn't just a spiritual consultant. She was part of an ancient order called the Watchers, tasked with monitoring the boundaries between worlds. The ritual I performed wasn't meant to contact dead soldiers, it was a test, designed to identify potential vessels for what she called the coming. Entry after entry detailed her observations of me growing up, noting signs I never recognized, my affinity for languages I'd never studied, the way animals would fall silent when I passed, how plants would either flourish or wither in my presence. I was being groomed, prepared, engineered through generations of careful breeding and occult manipulation. The bloodline must remain pure, one entry read. Each generation brings us closer to the perfect vessel. Trish shows more promise than any before her. May God forgive me for what I've set in motion. The final entry was dated the day before her death, It's done. The seal is in place. When she performs the ritual, believing it to be a simple spirit calling, she'll actually be opening a door that's been waiting for millennia. The child she bears will herald the beginning of the end. The morning star will rise again through innocent blood. I vomited right there on her grave, but what came up wasn't just stomach acid, it was a black substance that seemed to crawl across the ground like living mercury, forming those same damned symbols I kept seeing everywhere. That night, my dreams were different. I saw Kirk again, but not as the handsome young soldier. His true form was horrifying, a twisted mass of wings and eyes, all melded together with human features in impossible ways. He showed me visions of what was to come, cities burning with blue fire, children born with mirrors for eyes, the sky filling with creatures that defy description. "You're not just carrying a child," he told me, his voice now a chorus of thousands. "You're carrying the key that will unlock the final seal. When your baby draws its first breath, it will exhale the death of this world and inhale the birth of a new one. I've tried everything to end this pregnancy. Nothing works. Traditional methods fail spectacularly, medical instruments malfunction, medications transmute into sand in my mouth, even the most determined doctors suddenly forget who I am mid-procedure. More desperate measures prove equally futile. Any harm I try to inflict on myself heals instantly, leaving behind more of those wing-like scars. The changes are accelerating now. My teeth feel sharper, my vision has become so acute that I can see ultraviolet light, and sometimes, when I'm extremely upset, objects around me catch fire spontaneously. Last week, I woke to find my motel room's walls covered in prophecies written in ancient Enochian script, written by my own hands while I slept. But the worst part? The worst part is that I'm starting to want this baby. Not just physically, but with an intensity that terrifies me. When I press my hands against my swelling belly, I feel waves of love so profound they bring me to my knees. And I don't know if these feelings are really mine, or if they've been planted there by whatever is using my body as its unholy incubator. I dream of its face sometimes, beautiful beyond comprehension, terrible beyond sanity. Its eyes hold the death of stars and the birth of galaxies. When it smiles, I see the end of everything I've ever known and the beginning of something I cannot begin to understand. And still, I love it. God help me, I love it more than I've ever loved anything in my life. Dark dreams. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you were alone? That unease gnawed at me like a rat in the walls, an insidious discomfort creeping into the corners of my mind. I never believed in the supernatural. I was a practical man, grounded in the tangible world. But lately, things had changed. My dreams began to twist and coil like smoke, slithering through the edges of my waking life. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing from the remnants of a nightmare that clung to me like a damp shroud. I couldn't quite remember the details, but I could feel the oppressive weight of fear lingering in the room. I glanced at the clock, 6:15 a.m., too early for the world to be awake, yet I felt an overwhelming urge to escape the confines of my own home. With each passing day, the dreams became more vivid and disturbing. I saw faces that I recognized, but they were distorted, twisted in silent screams. I couldn't shake the feeling that these dreams were more than just figments of my imagination. They felt like warnings, but from whom? Or what? I would wake up, gasping, convinced that I could still hear the echoes of whispered words lingering in the air. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle changes around me. Objects in my home seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if they were trying to escape my gaze. My reflection in the mirror began to feel foreign, a stranger lurking just behind the glass. I would catch glimpses of it when I passed by, a fleeting shadow that left me questioning my own sanity. One evening, I decided to confront these dreams. I sat on the edge of my bed, the room dimly lit by the streetlight outside, casting long, trembling shadows across the floor. "You're just dreams," I told myself, trying to convince the part of me that was still clinging to reason. But deep down, I could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around my heart. That night, as I drifted into sleep, I resolved to face whatever awaited me. Little did I know, the line between dream and reality was about to blur in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. I could hear the wind howling outside, a portentous sound that sent chills down my spine. It felt as if the very air was charged with something sinister, something that whispered of doom. As I fell into a restless slumber, I found myself standing in a darkened forest, trees looming like ancient sentinels. The atmosphere was thick with fog, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. I could hear distant cries echoing, a haunting melody that made my blood run cold. My heart raced as I moved deeper into the forest, drawn by an unseen force that felt both terrifying and alluring. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist. I recognized it instantly. It was my brother, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "You have to wake up. It's coming for you," he screamed, his voice distorted, echoing through the silence of the woods. Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee, but the ground beneath my feet shifted, roots tangling around my ankles like grasping hands. And then, I woke up, heart pounding, body drenched in sweat. The room was dark and still, but the echoes of my brother's warning hung in the air, leaving me gasping for breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The sun rose the following morning, casting a pale light through the curtains. It felt like a fragile veil that barely concealed the darkness still lingering in my mind. I forced myself out of bed, my body heavy with dread. The room, once a sanctuary, felt more like a prison. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had a job to do, a life to lead. But as I moved through the house, the walls seemed to close in, echoing with the whispers of my dreams. I tried to shake off the residue of fear that clung to me like cobwebs. I brewed a strong cup of coffee, the familiar aroma soothing my frazzled nerves. Yet, the world outside my kitchen window looked strangely muted. The vibrant colors of autumn leaves appeared dulled, as if filtered through a haze of impending doom. At work, I struggled to focus. My colleagues chatted and laughed, their voices the distant hum. I was there, yet I felt profoundly isolated, as though an invisible barrier separated me from their joy. The faces of my coworkers morphed into the nightmarish visages from my dreams, their smiles twisted into grotesque expressions. I shook my head, trying to dispel the images, but they clung to the edges of my consciousness, gnawing at my sanity. During lunch, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, hoping to ground myself in reality. As I walked through the park, I noticed children playing, their laughter ringing like chimes in the crisp air. But even their innocent joy felt tainted. I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Every time a child stumbled or fell, I flinched as if something terrible might happen. It was irrational, yet the feeling was overwhelming, like a shadow creeping closer. That evening, I returned home and tried to lose myself in a book. I had always found solace in literature, but the words blurred on the page, their meaning slipping away like sand through my fingers. I glanced at the mirror across the room, and the reflection that stared back was a ghost of myself, hollow and haunted. As the day turned to night, I steeled myself for sleep, knowing that facing my dreams was inevitable. I lay in bed, heart racing as I fought against the urge to close my eyes. The familiar sense of dread washed over me, and just as I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness, I heard it, the faintest whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Come find me." Startled, I bolted upright, the darkness closing around me like a suffocating blanket. I could feel the chill seep into my bones, a coldness that suggested I was not alone. My instincts screamed for me to run, to escape this place that had become a prison of my own making, but where could I go? The walls of my home felt as though they were closing in, the very air thick with a sinister presence. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to summon courage, willing myself to confront whatever awaited me. When I opened them again, I was in the forest once more. The same twisted trees loomed above me, their gnarled branches like fingers reaching out, threatening to ensnare me. Panic rose in my throat as I realized I was no longer alone. The shadows danced between the trees, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I turned to find my brother again, but this time he stood further back, his face twisted in despair. "You have to listen," he yelled, but the sound was swallowed by the encroaching darkness. My heart raced as I felt the ground beneath me shift once more, the roots pulling me toward a shadowy figure that stood at the forest's edge. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, cold and calculating. I ran, the panic propelling me forward, but the forest shifted around me, paths twisting and turning, leading me deeper into its maw. I stumbled, falling to my knees as I gasped for breath. The shadows closed in, whispering my name, an ominous chant that echoed in the depths of my mind. "Help me!" I screamed, but my voice was lost in the cacophony of whispers. I could feel the shadows converging, a dark tide rising against me, and just when I thought I couldn't escape, I felt a hand on my shoulder, a touch that jolted me awake. I shot up in bed, drenched in sweat, the room around me bathed in moonlight. My heart thundered in my chest, the echoes of my dreams still ringing in my ears. I glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. Alone in the silence, I was left with only the distant echoes of my brother's pleas. The fear coiled within me, and I knew this was just the beginning. The sun crept slowly over the horizon, casting a muted glow into my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, every fiber of my being still tinged with the remnants of the nightmare. I could still feel the cold touch of the shadow on my shoulder, a ghostly reminder that something was lurking just out of reach. My mind raced with thoughts that collided like a storm, a whirlwind of dread and confusion. What did it all mean? Why was I being haunted by these dreams? I forced myself to get up and face the day, hoping that the brightness of the morning would somehow chase away the darkness that clung to me. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of freshly fallen leaves. But even as I stepped outside, the beauty of the world felt distorted. Birds chirped, but their songs seemed ominous, as if warning me of an impending danger I couldn't see. At work, I struggled to focus. My mind kept drifting back to my dreams, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were not confined to my subconscious. I noticed the way people glanced at me, their eyes filled with concern. Perhaps I had become a specter to them, a walking echo of someone who used to be whole. My boss called me into his office, his brow furrowed with worry. "Are you all right?" "You seem distracted," he said, concern lining his features. I forced a smile, but it felt brittle, like glass ready to shatter. "Just a bit tired. I haven't been sleeping well." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't buy it. As I left his office, I felt like I was carrying a heavy weight on my shoulders, a burden that felt heavier with each passing moment. I couldn't confide in anyone who would believe me. The visions, the whispers, they were mine to bear alone. As evening approached, I returned home, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. I decided to call my brother. Perhaps hearing his voice would dispel the shadows that haunted me. He answered on the second ring, his tone light. "Hey, it's been a while. How are you?" "I'm okay," I lied, forcing cheer into my voice. "Just been busy with work. How's everything with you?" "Good. Just the usual chaos," he replied, but I could hear the concern beneath his words. "Are you sure you're all right? You sound a bit off." I took a breath, contemplating whether to share my troubles. "I've been having some weird dreams, that's all," I admitted, trying to keep it casual. He fell silent for a moment, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. "Weird dreams? Like what?" I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to reveal the depth of my fears. "You know, the usual stuff. Chasing, darkness, nothing too serious." "All right, if you say so. Just don't let it get to you. You know how your mind can play tricks," he said, trying to lighten the mood. I appreciated his effort, but the shadows were becoming harder to ignore. After hanging up, I wandered around the house, searching for something to distract myself. I picked up a book, but the words blurred together, a jumble of letters that made no sense. I tossed it aside and stared at the mirror, the familiar reflection staring back at me. But today, there was something unsettling about it. The eyes seemed darker, more hollow, as if the person looking back was a mere shell of who I used to be. As night fell, I prepared for sleep, knowing that I had to confront the darkness that awaited me. I lay in bed, the room cloaked in shadows. My heart raced as I felt the familiar chill creep in. I closed my eyes, determined to face whatever was coming, hoping for answers this time. When I finally drifted off, I found myself back in the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches casting sinister shadows that danced in the moonlight. I could hear the distant whispers again, but this time they were clearer, as if beckoning me deeper into the woods. The air was thick with anticipation and electric tension that made my skin crawl. "Come find me," the voice urged, echoing around me like a siren's call. I took a step forward, heart pounding, when I spotted a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was my brother, standing at the edge of the clearing, looking lost and afraid. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted, his voice laced with panic. "Why? What's happening?" I called back, desperation flooding my voice. I could see the shadows swirling around him, creeping closer, hungry and alive. "Run!" he screamed, but before I could react, the shadows enveloped him and he vanished into the darkness. Panic surged through me. I turned to flee, but the forest twisted around me, trapping me in its malevolent embrace. The shadows whispered my name, a chilling echo that reverberated in my skull. "You belong to us," they chanted, the sound rising to a crescendo that drowned out my thoughts. Just as I thought I couldn't escape, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if the darkness was pulling me apart from the inside. I gasped for air, stumbling backward until I fell, the ground rising to meet me. I felt myself sinking into the earth, the roots pulling me down, suffocating me in their grasp. And then I woke up, the familiar panic striking me like a lightning bolt. I was back in my room, the moon casting silver beams across the walls. But something was different. The whispers were no longer confined to my dreams, they echoed in the corners of my mind, insistent and unyielding. The morning sun spilled into my room, warm and bright, but it offered no comfort. I lay in bed, heart racing as I replayed the events of my nightmare. The vivid images of my brother being swallowed by shadows haunted me, clinging to my thoughts like a smog. I could still hear his terrified voice urging me to run, and the weight of his absence pressed heavily on my chest. As I got up, I glanced at the mirror, half expecting the reflection to reveal some sign of my inner turmoil. Instead, I saw only a weary man, hair disheveled and eyes rimmed with dark circles. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to banish the remnants of sleep and the shadows lurking in my mind. I needed clarity. I needed to understand what was happening. After a quick breakfast, I resolved to go for a walk, something to clear my head. The fresh air might help wash away the cobwebs of fear that clung to me. I stepped outside, the world awash in autumn colors, vibrant oranges and reds, leaves crunching beneath my feet. But even the beauty of nature felt tainted. The wind rustled through the trees, whispering secrets that made my skin prickle. I walked to the park where I often went as a child. It was supposed to be a place of peace, but today it felt eerie. The swings creaked in the breeze, their rhythmic motion a haunting reminder of forgotten laughter. I settled onto a bench, trying to breathe deeply and steady my racing heart. As I sat there, I noticed a girl playing nearby, her laughter ringing out like a chime. She swung higher and higher, her hair flying back in the wind. But something about her gaze made my stomach twist. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if watching for something just out of sight. I followed her gaze, but saw only the mundane trees, benches, and the distant outline of the city skyline. I shook my head, trying to dispel the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting. I turned my attention back to the girl, but she had stopped swinging and was staring directly at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an unexpected weight. I forced a smile, trying to project calm. "Just a little tired," I replied. "What about you? Having fun?" Her expression shifted, a mix of concern and understanding. "You shouldn't play alone. It can be scary. Shadows can get you when you're not looking." My breath caught in my throat. I tried to brush off her words, but they echoed in my mind. Shadows. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt an urge to flee, to escape the park and the unsettling aura that clung to it. "Thanks for the advice," I said, forcing a chuckle. "I'll keep that in mind." I stood up and walked away, trying to shake off the lingering dread. I couldn't let a child's words unnerve me. I was an adult, rational and grounded. But the further I walked, the more I felt the weight of her gaze upon me, as if she knew something I didn't. Returning home, I fought against the urge to look over my shoulder, fearing what I might find lurking in the shadows of my own life. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, a small act that provided a fleeting sense of security. I grabbed a pen and notepad, desperate to pour my thoughts onto paper, hoping to exorcise the demons that clung to me. The words flowed like a river, a stream of consciousness that unraveled the chaos in my mind. I wrote about the dreams, the darkness, and the feeling of being watched. Each stroke of the pen felt cathartic, but as I scribbled, the unease crept back in. The whispers from my dreams seemed to resonate through the ink, and I had to pause, looking around as if expecting something to materialize. As night fell, I prepared myself for sleep again, a ritual that felt both necessary and terrifying. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me as if they could shield me from whatever lurked beyond. I closed my eyes, reciting mantras in my head to calm my racing heart. "It's just a dream. It's just a dream," I whispered. But as I drifted off, I could feel the familiar pull of the dream world. This time, I braced myself for what awaited me. The forest enveloped me once more, but it felt different, more alive, more menacing. The trees loomed higher, their branches twisting into the sky like dark fingers. The whispers echoed through the air, growing louder, more insistent. "Come find us," they beckoned, a chilling chorus that filled me with dread. I stumbled forward, heart pounding, knowing I had to confront whatever awaited me in this shadowy realm. I felt an overwhelming urge to call for my brother, but I knew it would do no good. He was lost to the darkness, just as I was. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I caught sight of the flickering shadows flitting between the trees. They danced and twirled, taunting me with their ephemeral forms. I felt a shiver of recognition as one shadow morphed into a familiar figure, my brother's face, twisted in anguish. "Help me," he cried, but his voice was distorted, echoing off the trees like a haunting melody. I reached out, desperate to save him, but he dissolved into the darkness, leaving me alone once more. The ground beneath me trembled as the shadows began to converge, a writhing mass that threatened to swallow me whole. I turned to run, but every path seemed to lead me deeper into the abyss. Panic clawed at my throat, and I stumbled, falling to my knees as the shadows enveloped me, their cold fingers reaching out to claim me. And just when I thought I would be consumed, I woke up again, gasping for breath. The moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating the room with an eerie glow. But this time, I sensed a change in the air. The whispers had become clearer, their meanings unfurling like dark petals in my mind. They were calling to me, urging me to uncover the truth hidden in the shadows. The light of dawn broke through my window, soft yet insistent, pulling me from the depths of a troubled sleep. I sat up in bed, my heart still racing from the vivid nightmare that clung to me like a second skin. The whispers echoed in my mind, urging me to confront whatever malevolent force lurked in the corners of my life. I could no longer dismiss them as mere figments of my imagination. They were a call to action, a challenge that gnawed at my sanity. I threw back the covers, feeling an unusual determination surge within me. I had to uncover the truth behind my dreams, the shadows that danced just out of reach. But where would I begin? I glanced around my room, searching for answers in the familiar chaos of my belongings. The books on my shelf, psychology, dreams, nightmares, stood as silent witnesses to my plight. Grabbing a book on dream interpretation, I sank into an armchair with a steaming cup of coffee. I flipped through the pages, desperate to find meaning in my night terrors. Shadows, I read aloud, the word heavy on my tongue. Symbolized fear, the unknown, repressed feelings. Each description struck a chord, resonating deep within me. But I needed more than abstract definitions. I needed concrete answers. I spent the morning poring over texts, scribbling notes and highlighting passages. The more I read, the more the shadows felt real, an extension of my own psyche. I jotted down anything that resonated, but it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite grasp. My thoughts drifted back to the girl in the park, her warning echoing in my ears. Shadows can get you when you're not looking. Was it mere child's play, or did she possess some insight I lacked? As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, I felt the weight of my own paranoia press down. I decided to reach out to my brother again. Maybe he could help me make sense of this. We had always shared a bond that transcended words. Dialing his number, I paced the room, a sense of dread coiling in my stomach as the phone rang. "Hey." "What's up?" he answered, his voice bright and familiar. "Can we talk?" I said, struggling to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I've been having these dreams, and they're getting worse." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. "What do you mean worse?" "Like scary worse or more than scary. They feel real, and I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong, something is coming for me, I confessed, feeling exposed and vulnerable. All right, calm down, he said, his tone shifting to one of concern. Do you want me to come over? Yeah, I think that would help, I replied, a wave of relief washing over me. I needed someone to anchor me, someone who could remind me of reality in this storm of shadows. When he arrived an hour later, I was pacing the living room, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence. The moment he stepped through the door, I felt a surge of comfort. You look like you've seen a ghost, he teased lightly, but his expression quickly turned serious. What's really going on? I took a deep breath, the weight of my fears spilling out. I told him everything about the dreams, the girl in the park, the whispers. I watched his concern etched itself onto his face, and I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. Maybe it's stress. You've been working a lot lately, right? He suggested. Maybe. But it feels deeper than that, I insisted. I think it's connected to something, some unresolved issue. I just don't know what. We sat together on the couch, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. I could sense he was trying to process everything, to find a way to comfort me, but he seemed at a loss for words. You know, I've had my share of strange dreams too, he said finally. But I never thought much of them. Tell me about them, I urged, desperate for any clue that could illuminate my own situation. He hesitated for a moment, the memories flickering behind his eyes. Sometimes, I dream about our childhood home. It's always the same, dark, empty rooms, a feeling of being watched. I wake up feeling like I'm not alone, like someone is still there. His words sent a shiver down my spine, resonating with the shadows that danced in my mind. What do you think it means? I asked, leaning forward. I don't know. Maybe it's just nostalgia or fear of the past, he replied. But what if it's more? What if those feelings are tied to something we buried? I felt a spark of recognition, a flicker of understanding that lit up the dim corners of my mind. The past, I whispered, realization dawning on me. There's something we're not addressing, something from our childhood. As we delved into memories, fragments of our past resurfaced. I recalled the strange events that surrounded our family, odd occurrences that had been dismissed as mere coincidence. There were whispers about our house being haunted, stories we had laughed off, yet they lingered in the back of my mind like a long-forgotten melody. I think we need to investigate, I said, a sudden rush of determination coursing through me. We can't let the shadows win. We have to confront them. My brother nodded slowly, his expression shifting from uncertainty to resolve. All right. But we need to be careful. This isn't just a dream anymore, it's becoming real. That night, armed with flashlights and a stack of old family photographs, we returned to our childhood home, a place that had stood empty for years. The air was thick with tension as we approached the front door, memories flooding my mind, laughter, warmth, and the inexplicable chill that had always lingered in the corners of the house. As we stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeted us. Dust hung in the air like memories long forgotten, and the darkness felt alive, wrapping around us as we moved deeper into the house. Shadows loomed in every corner, and I could feel them watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. Let's start in the living room, I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. We made our way to the room where we had spent countless hours playing, the walls echoing with laughter that now felt hollow. I shined my flashlight around, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and empty spaces where furniture had once stood. My brother paused, his eyes wide as he gazed at the fireplace. Remember that night? He asked, a tremor in his voice. The storm? I nodded, the memory flooding back. A fierce thunderstorm had rolled in, the winds howling like banshees outside. We had huddled in front of the fireplace, listening to our parents argue in hushed tones. That night, I had seen something, shadows flickering in the corners of the room, moving of their own accord. Do you think it was real? I asked, feeling the air grow heavier around us. I don't know. But it feels like there's something here, something we can't see, he replied, his voice trembling. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind rushed through the room, extinguishing our flashlights. Darkness swallowed us, and I felt the familiar presence of shadows swirling around, enveloping us in their embrace. Stay close, I whispered, gripping my brother's arm tightly. Panic surged within me, but I couldn't let fear take hold. I had to confront the darkness, to unearth the truth buried within these walls. As we fumbled in the dark, I could hear the whispers again, clearer this time, wrapping around us like a thick fog. You've come back, they hissed, and I felt a shiver of recognition. You cannot escape us. In the suffocating darkness, fear coiled around us like a serpent, constricting my chest. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the whispers that echoed through the room. You've come back, they taunted, their voices the haunting chorus that seeped into my bones. I gripped my brother's arm tighter, feeling the tension radiate off him as the shadows surged forward. Stay close, I repeated, my voice steady despite the quaking of my insides. We moved cautiously, hands outstretched, feeling our way through the oppressive void. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a cacophony, each voice overlapping the other, rising and falling like a dark tide. You shouldn't have come back, they hissed, the sound wrapping around me like chains. I could almost see the shapes of the shadows, flickering at the edge of my vision, their forms shifting and swirling. I think I see something, my brother whispered, breaking through the oppressive noise. He pointed into the darkness, and I strained my eyes to focus on what he had spotted. A faint glow illuminated a corner of the room, barely visible but drawing me in like a moth to a flame. Let's check it out, I urged, steeling myself against the dread clawing at my insides. We moved toward the glow, each step tentative, each breath a struggle against the fear that threatened to overtake us. As we approached, the light revealed itself, a dusty old mirror, its surface marred with age and grime. It stood propped against the wall, reflecting fragments of our surroundings in an almost ghostly manner. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized it, the very mirror from my childhood, the one that had always felt out of place, an object of fascination and dread. What's this doing here? My brother asked, his voice barely a whisper. I thought it was gone. I reached out to touch the frame, a shiver running through me as my fingers brushed the cool surface. Memories surged forth, swirling like smoke. I remembered late-night whispers, shadows dancing in the glass, and the way the mirror seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It had always felt like a portal, a gateway to something dark and hidden. As I peered into the mirror, the glow intensified, illuminating the shadows swirling around us. I could see our reflections, but they looked different. My own eyes stared back, wide and filled with terror, but there was something else, a fleeting image, a figure standing behind me, its features obscured by darkness. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Did you see that? I gasped, turning back to the mirror. There was something, behind me. My brother leaned closer, squinting into the glass. I don't see anything, he murmured, uncertainty creeping into his voice. But I can feel it. Something's not right here. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a storm. "You cannot escape us," they chanted, a chorus of lost souls echoing through the room. I pressed my hands against the cool surface of the mirror, feeling the vibrations thrumming beneath my fingertips. "What do you want?" I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. In response, the shadows coalesced, forming shapes that morphed into familiar faces, friends, family, and then the figure of a child. My heart dropped as I recognized the girl from the park. She stood there, her expression a mixture of sorrow and fear, trapped within the glass. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the roar of the shadows. "They won't let me go." "Who won't let you go?" I shouted, the urgency in my voice rising. I felt my brother shift uneasily beside me, the air thickening with dread. "The shadows," she replied, her voice a haunting echo. "They feed on fear. You have to face them. You have to remember." The mirror began to ripple like water, the surface distorting as the shadows reached for us. I could feel their cold tendrils brushing against my skin, sending chills down my spine. "What do we remember?" I pleaded, desperate for answers. "Your past," she whispered, her image flickering. "Find the truth. You must confront it." Suddenly, the mirror shattered, glass splintering into 1,000 shards, each reflecting our frightened faces and the encroaching darkness. A scream erupted from my lips as I stumbled backward, falling against my brother. The room exploded into chaos, shadows swirling around us, pulling at the edges of my sanity. "Run!" my brother shouted, his voice breaking through the panic. We scrambled to our feet, racing toward the door, adrenaline surging through our veins. But the shadows closed in, their presence suffocating, wrapping around us like a vice. As we barreled through the door, I could hear the whispers crescendo, a frantic plea intertwined with sinister laughter. "You cannot escape," they chanted, and I felt their cold breath on the back of my neck, threatening to drag me back into the darkness. We burst out of the house into the cool night air, gasping for breath as we stumbled onto the front porch. The familiar landscape of our childhood loomed before us, but it felt altered, twisted. Shadows danced beneath the trees, their forms elongated and distorted, watching us with an insatiable hunger. "Did you see that?" my brother panted, eyes wide with fear. "The girl, she was trapped in the mirror." "I know," I replied, shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. "She needs our help, but we have to figure out what it means." "Let's get out of here," he urged, glancing back at the house as if expecting it to come alive and reach for us. I nodded, the weight of dread settling in my gut. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The shadows were just beginning to unveil their secrets. As we drove away, the memories of our childhood home loomed in the rearview mirror, and I could still hear the whispers, faint yet insistent, urging me to remember. What truth was buried there? What darkness had we locked away, refusing to confront? I felt the shadows swirling within me, a storm of fear and uncertainty, but I also felt a flicker of resolve. I had to confront my past, to face whatever lay hidden in the depths of my nightmares. The truth awaited me, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The drive home was eerily quiet, the darkness outside thickening around us as if it were a living entity. My brother's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white against the night. The shadows cast by passing streetlights flickered through the car, making the interior feel like a ghostly shell. I could sense his tension, a reflection of my own, as we processed what we had just experienced. "What do you think it all means?" he finally asked, breaking the silence that had settled uncomfortably between us. I turned to him, the question lingering like a specter in the air. I think it's something we've buried, I said slowly, trying to sift through the chaos of my thoughts. The girl, the mirror, the house. They're all connected. We just need to figure out how. He nodded, a frown deepening on his face. What if it's dangerous? What if we're opening something that shouldn't be disturbed? His voice trembled slightly, the fear palpable. I swallowed hard, recalling the girl's desperate plea for help. But if we don't confront it, what happens? The shadows will just grow stronger. We can't ignore it anymore. His silence spoke volumes, and I could see the conflict within him. Finally, he sighed, the weight of resignation settling in. All right. But we do this together. No more secrets. As we pulled into the driveway, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The house loomed before us, dark and silent, like a predator waiting patiently for its prey. I felt the familiar chill creep up my spine as I stepped inside, the shadows immediately enveloping me like an old friend. Do you want to try and sleep? He suggested cautiously, glancing at me with concern. Maybe your dreams will guide you. I hesitated. The very idea of sleeping terrified me. But deep down, I knew I had to face the nightmares that had begun this twisted journey. I think I have to, I replied, determination mingling with fear. After a brief, anxious conversation about what our next steps would be, we decided to take shifts, ensuring that one of us would be awake while the other slept. I settled into my bedroom, the familiar surroundings now fraught with tension. As I lay down, the shadows seemed to coalesce in the corners, watching, waiting. I closed my eyes, focusing on my breathing, willing myself to relax. The first moments of sleep were gentle, a slip into darkness where reality blurred into dream. But then, the whispers returned, wrapping around me like a thick fog. You've returned, they cooed, their tones both inviting and sinister. I felt the shadows enveloping me, pulling me down into a familiar abyss. I stood once again in the dreamscape, the park shrouded in an eerie twilight. The girl stood at the center, her face pale, eyes wide with urgency. You have to remember, she implored, reaching out toward me. It's not just about me, it's about all of us. About what? I demanded, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. What do you mean? The game, she whispered, her voice trembling. You were part of it. You have to remember the night. Suddenly, the scene shifted, the park dissolving into memories of that fateful evening long ago. I found myself in the living room of our childhood home, the storm raging outside, wind howling like a banshee. My brother and I were playing a game, laughter echoing through the halls as we built forts from blankets, the sound of thunder providing a thrilling backdrop. But then, something shifted. The atmosphere turned heavy, oppressive, as the whispers of the shadows began to seep through the cracks, darkening the room. I could feel a tension in the air, an unseen force pressing against us, pulling us deeper into the night. We have to go upstairs, I heard my childhood self say, but the voice was not mine. It was a command, an urge driven by something far darker than we could comprehend. The scene around me shifted again, and I was now standing in the hallway, the door to the attic ajar. What's up there? I asked, feeling a chill seep into my bones. Truth, the girl replied, her eyes reflecting the flicker of fear and determination. You have to confront it. You have to remember what happened. Before I could respond, the attic door swung open, a gust of wind spiraling down the stairs, beckoning me to step forward. I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach. What if it's too late? I murmured. Then it will consume you, she warned, her voice growing faint as the shadows began to creep in, enveloping her figure. You have to face the darkness before it claims you. With a surge of courage, I stepped toward the attic, heart pounding in my chest. As I ascended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the shadows writhed around me, taunting me with whispers of forgotten fears. I reached the top, and the door creaked open to reveal a darkened room filled with dust and silence. In the center stood an old trunk, its edges frayed, as if it had been waiting for me. I approached cautiously, memories flooding my mind like a rushing tide. What's inside? I breathed, the question lingering in the air. Your truth, the girl echoed softly, and I felt a rush of dread and anticipation. As I opened the trunk, a blinding light erupted from within, casting away the shadows. Images flashed before my eyes, snapshots of laughter, joy, and then darkness. I saw the game we had played, the excitement transforming into fear as the shadows enveloped us. The memories of that stormy night flooded back, pieces I had locked away for so long. There had been whispers that night, an invitation to play a game with the shadows. A game that had turned into a nightmare. The air grew thick, and I could feel the shadows tightening their grip, desperate to pull me back into their embrace. You cannot escape the truth, they shrieked, their voices rising in a frenzy. I fought against the pull, focusing on the light from the trunk, determined to break free. I am not afraid, I shouted, forcing my voice to rise above the chaos. I will remember. As I did, the trunk erupted in a burst of energy, shadows scattering in all directions. The light enveloped me, illuminating the darkness that had threatened to consume my past. The girl's image flickered before me, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. You've remembered, she said, her voice a whisper now. But it's not over yet. You must confront them, not just in the dream, but in reality. They will come for you. With that, the light faded, and I found myself back in my bed, gasping for breath. The shadows loomed in the corners of my room, but this time I felt a surge of power coursing through me. I could face them. I had to face them. Wake up! I shouted, my voice cutting through the stillness. I turned to see my brother stirring, his expression groggy with sleep. We have to go back. He blinked at me, confusion in his eyes. Back where? What happened? The attic, I replied, urgency flooding my veins. We have to confront the shadows. They're coming for us. The morning light spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, but I felt no comfort in its warmth. Instead, it was a reminder that time was slipping away, that we had to act before the shadows fully emerged from the depths of our past. I glanced at my brother, who was now fully awake, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as the gravity of our situation sank in. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice steady but laced with apprehension. What if we open something we can't close? I swallowed hard, remembering the girl's pleading eyes. We have to do this. We can't keep running. The shadows will only grow stronger if we don't face them. I took a deep breath, determination bolstering my resolve. Let's end this. We made our way back to the attic, the familiar creak of the stairs echoing in the stillness. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with tension and unspoken fears. I could feel the shadows lurking, waiting for our hesitation. As we reached the attic door, I paused, glancing at my brother. Whatever happens, stick together. Don't let them pull you away. He nodded, steeling himself beside me. I pushed the door open, and a rush of stale air greeted us, heavy with dust and memories. The light from the attic window illuminated the room, but the corners remained shrouded in darkness, the shadows clinging to the walls like a forgotten nightmare. In the center stood the trunk, now eerily still. I felt the weight of its presence, a palpable connection to the past that had haunted us for so long. My heart raced as I approached it, each beat echoing the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Are you ready?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Let's do it," my brother replied, taking a deep breath as he stepped forward with me. We opened the trunk together, and the blinding light burst forth once again, illuminating the room. This time, the shadows writhed violently, contorting in response to the light, howling with fury and desperation. "Stay close," I shouted, feeling their cold fingers clawing at my mind, attempting to unearth my deepest fears. I focused on the light, drawing strength from it as I prepared for the confrontation. Suddenly, the whispers morphed into a cacophony of screams, voices overlapping in a frenzied demand. "You cannot escape. You invited us in." The words struck like a thunderclap, jolting memories to the surface. I remembered that night, the storm, the laughter, how we had unwittingly invited the shadows into our lives, treating it like a game. My mind raced, connecting the dots. "You were nothing but a trick," I yelled into the chaos, my voice rising above the noise. "We will not play your game anymore." The shadows surged forward, forming a twisted mass, faces emerging from the darkness, faces I recognized, friends and family distorted by fear and regret. They reached for me, eyes pleading and filled with sorrow. "Help us," they cried, but I stood firm. "No," I shouted, rage and fear colliding within me. "You chose to stay in the shadows. You must face your own darkness." My brother stepped beside me, his face pale but resolute. "We're not afraid of you," he declared, his voice strong. "We're taking back our lives." The shadows recoiled, the energy shifting as the light began to pulse brighter. "You cannot fight us. You are one of us," they screamed, their voices fraying at the edges, echoing with despair. "No," I repeated, grounding myself in the present. "I am not defined by your darkness. We are more than this." With that declaration, the light exploded from the trunk, washing over the room, piercing through the shadows like a knife. The cacophony of screams turned into howls of anguish as the darkness writhed and twisted, struggling against the overwhelming light. "Face your fear," I cried, reaching out to the figures within the shadows, the echoes of my past. "It's time to let go. We can't live like this anymore." The figures hesitated, their forms flickering as the light intensified. I could see their faces, hints of recognition, pain, and ultimately, hope. One by one, they began to step forward, embracing the light, allowing it to envelop them. "Help us remember," the girl's voice resonated through the chaos, her image emerging from the shadows. "Help us find peace. Let go of the fear," I urged, feeling the strength of my brother beside me, anchoring me as we stood united against the darkness. The light swelled, illuminating every corner of the attic, banishing the shadows that had haunted us for so long. As the last of the figures stepped into the light, a profound silence fell over the room. The shadows dissolved, retreating into the recesses of my mind, finally releasing their hold on my past. The girl smiled at me, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fading like the echoes of a dream. "You have freed us." With one final flash of light, the trunk slammed shut, sealing away the darkness that had plagued me for so long. The attic felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere dissipating like fog under the sun. I turned to my brother, breathless with the intensity of the moment. "Did we do it?" I asked, my voice shaky but filled with hope. He nodded, a mixture of disbelief and relief washing over him. "I think we did," he said slowly, as if testing the reality of our triumph. As we stepped out of the attic, the sunlight pouring in through the windows, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The shadows had been confronted and defeated. The past, while painful, no longer held power over us. Yet, as I glanced back at the attic, I knew that the journey wasn't over. The truth we had uncovered was merely the beginning, a stepping stone toward healing. I had faced the shadows, and in doing so, I had begun to reclaim my life. "Let's go get some fresh air," my brother suggested, breaking the silence. "I think we deserve it." I smiled at him, the warmth of the sunlight filling my heart with hope. "Yeah, let's do that." As we stepped outside, I felt a newfound sense of freedom. The darkness that had once threatened to consume me had been vanquished, but I knew that the journey toward healing would continue. The shadows may return, but now I was armed with the strength of my memories and the love of those I had fought for. Together, we would face whatever lay ahead, ready to embrace the light. The invisible creature. Have you ever felt something watching you, even when you were utterly alone? I didn't believe in ghosts or any supernatural nonsense until that fateful autumn evening. As the last rays of the sun faded behind the horizon, the shadows in my modest home grew longer, deeper. It was during this time that I first sensed it, a strange, unsettling presence that lingered in the corners of my mind and the dimly lit rooms of my house. I lived alone, or at least I thought I did. My name is Clara, and I had always cherished my solitude. It provided me with a sense of peace, a comforting cocoon from the chaos of the outside world. Yet, on that evening, as I sat curled up on my worn-out sofa, a sensation crept over me like a chill. The air seemed to thicken, and my heart raced for reasons I couldn't fathom. As I absent-mindedly flipped through the pages of a book, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned my head quickly, but the room was empty, just the flickering shadows cast by the dying light. I brushed it off, attributing the sensation to fatigue. After all, I had spent a long week at work, and the quiet of the house was sometimes overwhelming. But that night, as I prepared for bed, the feeling only intensified. I noticed the way the curtains danced with the night breeze, how the wooden floor creaked underfoot, as if something else was sharing the space with me. I shut my eyes tightly, willing myself to sleep, but the unease gnawed at my consciousness. In the dead of night, I woke up abruptly, my body frozen in a state of panic. A weight pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I blinked into the darkness, my heart thumping loudly in my ears. Was it just a nightmare? Or was it something more sinister? I strained to listen, searching for any sound that might break the silence. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering sound, like the rustle of leaves. My instinct screamed for me to get up, to turn on the lights, but I couldn't move. It was as if an unseen force had wrapped its fingers around me, holding me hostage in my own bed. Just when I thought I might scream, the sound faded, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. As I lay there, drenched in sweat and trembling, I made a decision. I would not let fear dictate my life. Tomorrow, I would confront this invisible creature haunting my home. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel my sanity. The sun rose reluctantly the next morning, casting a pale light through the half-closed curtains. I stumbled out of bed, my body still heavy from the sleepless night. The remnants of that unsettling weight lingered in the corners of my mind, whispering doubt into my thoughts. How could I confront something I couldn't even see? As I brewed a cup of coffee, the familiar aroma filled the air, providing a momentary reprieve from my anxiety. I stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the vibrant leaves, painted in hues of red and gold. Autumn had always been my favorite season, but now it felt tainted, as if the beauty outside was mocking my inner turmoil. I decided to distract myself. A long overdue visit to the local library would be a perfect way to spend the day. I dressed quickly, pushing aside the lingering sense of dread that clung to me. Perhaps I could lose myself in stories that didn't involve invisible creatures lurking in my home. The library was my sanctuary, filled with the musty scent of old pages and the soft whispers of fellow readers. I wandered through the aisles, fingers trailing along the spines of countless books. But even here, among the literary treasures, I felt the weight of eyes upon me. Shaking off the sensation, I chose a cozy corner and settled in with a novel, hoping to lose myself in its pages. Yet, as I read, my mind kept drifting back to the whispers from last night. Was I losing my grip on reality? I closed the book, unable to concentrate. The stories of ghosts and hauntings began to feel all too real, the words leaping off the page and weaving into my own experience. After several hours, I left the library, my mind still racing. I walked back home, trying to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. Everyone feels a little paranoid sometimes, right? I just needed to gather my thoughts and face my fears. When I arrived home, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick and stagnant, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I took a deep breath and made my way through the hallway, pausing at the mirror hanging on the wall. My reflection looked back at me, but something felt off. My eyes seemed distant, filled with unspoken worries. I shook my head, forcing myself to move on. That evening, as darkness enveloped the world outside, I lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting soft shadows across the walls. I wanted to create a comforting environment, something to counter the impending sense of doom that hung over me. I made a mental note to call a friend, to invite someone over, to share the space and dispel the isolation that had become so suffocating. But before I could dial the number, a sudden draft swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles. The abruptness of it sent a jolt through my body. I rushed to relight it, hands trembling as I struck a match. As the flame flickered back to life, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Was it my imagination playing tricks on me again? The flickering candlelight revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar shadows that danced along the walls. But as I stood there, straining to listen, I heard it again, the whispering, like a soft breeze teasing the edges of my sanity. With a deep breath, I stepped toward the hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to retreat to the safety of my candlelit sanctuary. But something compelled me to move forward. I had to confront whatever it was that lurked in the shadows. As I reached the end of the hallway, the whispering stopped abruptly. An uneasy silence enveloped me, thick and heavy. I glanced around, my heart racing, but all I found was the emptiness of my home. I felt a chill sweep through the air, making me shiver. Suddenly, I caught sight of my reflection in a small wall mirror. It looked different, distorted, almost as if the image behind the glass was trying to escape. A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. Just my imagination, I muttered, though even I didn't believe my own words. I decided then that I needed help. I could no longer face this alone. That night, sleep evaded me once again. I tossed and turned, every creak of the house amplifying my anxiety. I tried to convince myself that the whispering I had heard was just the wind or the settling of the house. Yet, deep down, I felt a gnawing certainty that something was very wrong. The next morning, I decided to take action. I called my friend Sarah, hoping her cheerful voice would ease my frayed nerves. As the phone rang, I rehearsed what I would say, but when she answered, the words stumbled out in a rush. "Hey, Sarah, can you come over? I think something's wrong in my house." "Clara, what do you mean?" she asked, her tone shifting to concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, really," I assured her, though my voice trembled. "It's just, I've been feeling like something's here, and I need someone with me." "I'll be over in a bit," she replied, and relief flooded through me. I spent the next hour pacing my living room, nervously glancing at the walls as if they held the answer to my growing dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When the doorbell finally rang, I rushed to answer it, my heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. "Hey, Clara," Sarah greeted, her bright smile a stark contrast to the dark cloud that hung over me. "What's going on?" "I don't know how to explain it," I said, leading her inside. "It's like I feel a presence. It's been getting worse, and I can't shake it off." "Let's do something fun to take your mind off it," she suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "How about a movie marathon?" As we settled on the couch with blankets and popcorn, I tried to focus on the film, but every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision pulled my attention away. I could feel Sarah occasionally glance my way, sensing my unease. I forced myself to smile, wanting to reassure her that everything was fine, but inside, I was a ball of nerves. Halfway through the first movie, the room fell silent. The film played on, but I felt an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. The air grew thick, and the flickering lights seemed to dim slightly, casting longer shadows around us. I glanced at Sarah, and her expression mirrored my own apprehension. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, breaking the silence. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the air just changed." Before I could say more, the lights flickered again and then went out completely. The sudden darkness enveloped us, and I could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath. "Clara, do you have candles?" she asked, her voice quaking with uncertainty. "Yes, I'll get them," I said, forcing myself to move. My heart raced as I stood up, groping for the way through the darkened room. I could feel the oppressive silence pressing against me, thickening the air around us. I fumbled in the drawer for a candle and a lighter, my hands shaking. As I finally got it lit, the small flame illuminated the room, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked around, the candlelight creating eerie shapes that seemed to twist and writhe. "Maybe we should just leave," she suggested, her voice trembling. "This feels wrong." "No, we can't. I need you here," I insisted, desperate to cling to some semblance of normalcy. "Let's just stay close and finish the movie." As the film resumed, I tried to focus on the story unfolding on the screen, but my mind wandered back to the whispers. I could still hear them faintly, like a haunting melody just out of reach. Was it real, or was I losing my grip on reality? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, startling us both. I jumped, nearly dropping the candle. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, her face pale. I don't know," I stammered, feeling a cold dread wash over me. Stay here. I'll check it out. Are you sure that's a good idea? She asked, anxiety evident in her voice. I nodded, though fear coiled tightly in my stomach. I couldn't let her see how terrified I was. I crept toward the kitchen, each step heavy with uncertainty. As I rounded the corner, the candlelight revealed broken dishes scattered across the floor. My heart sank. I hadn't been in there since we started the movie. Clara. Sarah's voice called out, panic rising in her tone. It's okay, I called back, trying to sound calm. Just a few plates. But as I surveyed the scene, my heart raced. I could feel the temperature drop, a chill seeping into my bones. I glanced back at the living room, the candle casting ominous shadows. I took a step closer to the mess, feeling a strange compulsion to understand what had happened. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed through the kitchen, extinguishing the candle. Darkness engulfed me, and I felt a rush of panic as I fumbled to find my way back to Sarah. I could hear her voice, rising in pitch as she called my name, but the shadows seemed to close in around me. Clara, she shouted again, her voice breaking through the suffocating darkness. I finally reached the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped back into the living room, I felt a presence behind me, cold and heavy. I turned just in time to see something dart past the edge of my vision, a blur that sent a chill racing down my spine. Did you see that? I gasped, breathless. See what? Sarah asked, wide-eyed and trembling. Something moved. In the kitchen. I said, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She was trying to convince herself it was just a figment of my imagination. I think we should go, she said firmly, grabbing my arm. Let's just get out of here. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel it now, that oppressive weight pressing down on us, as if the house itself was pushing us away. I nodded, and we hurried to the front door, but just as we reached for the handle, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the chaos in the kitchen. I glanced back, and there it was again, a dark shape lingering at the edge of the kitchen doorway, too indistinct to recognize. A shiver ran through me as I stumbled back, the door handle slipping from my grasp. What is happening? Sarah asked, her voice a mix of fear and confusion. I don't know, but we need to get out now, I urged, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the door. But as we rushed out, the feeling of being watched intensified, a gaze that felt predatory, hungry. I knew in that moment, deep within my bones, that whatever it was had no intention of letting us go. The door slammed shut behind us, the sound reverberating in my ears as I stepped into the cool night air. I didn't stop to breathe, didn't look back at my house, the house that now felt like a sinister entity, pulsating with malevolence. Clara! Sarah exclaimed, her voice shaking. What just happened in there? You looked terrified. I was terrified, I admitted, my heart racing as I scanned the dimly lit street. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting long shadows across the pavement. Something was in the kitchen. I don't know what it was, but it felt wrong. Maybe we should call someone, she suggested, her eyes darting nervously around us. A paranormal investigator or something. No. I blurted out, panic rising again. I can't let anyone else know. What if they think I'm crazy? I'm not going to let you deal with this alone, Sarah insisted, her brow furrowing in determination. You're my best friend, and I'm not leaving you. We should go back in. Are you out of your mind? I snapped, frustration bubbling over. You want to go back into that house? I don't want to leave you, she replied, her voice softening. We need to figure out what's going on, together. For a moment, I hesitated, torn between the safety of the outside world and the compulsion to confront the darkness lurking within my home. But I knew I couldn't let fear rule me. If I didn't face it now, I would only be prolonging the inevitable. Okay, I finally said, determination hardening my resolve. But we go in together, and we don't split up. With a nod, we returned to the house, the familiar facade now feeling alien and threatening. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as if protesting our return. We stepped inside, and I immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere, heavier than before. Stay close, I whispered to Sarah, who nodded, her face pale but resolute. As we moved through the living room, I noticed the candles I had lit were now flickering erratically. Shadows danced along the walls, as if alive, and I could almost hear them whispering my name, luring me deeper into the abyss. What should we do? Sarah asked, her voice trembling as we approached the kitchen. We need to find out what caused the dishes to fall, I replied, trying to sound brave despite the fear coiling in my stomach. Maybe it was just an accident. We stepped into the kitchen, the light overhead buzzing ominously. The broken plates lay scattered across the floor, shards glimmering like jagged teeth. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I picked up a piece, the sharp edge biting into my palm. As I straightened up, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flickered in the hallway, and I felt a rush of cold air sweep past me, making the hair on my arms stand on end. Did you see that? I whispered, my voice barely a breath. See what? Sarah asked, her eyes darting around the room. They're over there. I pointed, heart racing. The shadow had vanished, but the chill lingered. I swear something just moved. I don't like this, Clara, Sarah said, stepping closer to me. Maybe we should just leave. No. I interrupted, more forcefully than I intended. I need to understand what's happening. If we leave now, I'll never be able to come back. We stood in the kitchen, the tension palpable as the shadows deepened around us. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to calm my racing heart. We need to ask it to reveal itself, I said, surprising myself with the words. If something is here, we need to confront it. Are you serious? Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. You want to talk to it? Yes, I insisted. If it's here, we can't keep ignoring it. We have to face it head on. Fine, she relented, her voice shaky. But I'm not doing this alone. I nodded, our fears merging into a single resolve. We stood shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped tightly. Is there anyone here? I called out, my voice steady despite the fear threatening to break through. If you're here, show yourself. Silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. The shadows seemed to shift, elongating and twisting, as if waiting for something to happen. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears. Clara, this is crazy, Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the doorway. Just give it a moment, I urged, trying to remain calm. If it's trying to communicate, we have to be patient. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floorboards and into our bones. The lights flickered above us, casting a strobe-like effect as the shadows danced wildly around the room. What is happening? Sarah gasped, her grip tightening on my hand. I don't know, I replied, adrenaline surging through me. Stay close. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the hum stopped, plunging us into an eerie silence. But the atmosphere had changed. It felt charged, electric, as if something was watching us intently. I took a tentative step forward, my breath shallow. "If you can hear us, please show us a sign," I called out again, my voice trembling. The air thickened, and I felt a gust of wind sweep through the kitchen, rustling the disarray of dishes on the floor. A single plate lifted slightly, teetering on the edge before crashing down. We both jumped back, hearts pounding wildly in our chests. "Okay, that's it. I'm done," Sarah exclaimed, her eyes wide with fear. "Let's get out of here." "No. We can't run away now," I pleaded, feeling a sense of urgency rising within me. "It's trying to communicate." Just then, I noticed something, an outline, faint but discernible, hovering at the edge of the kitchen doorway. It flickered in and out of focus, like a television signal struggling to come through. My heart raced as I squinted, trying to discern what it was. "Clara, what are you looking at?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I think it's trying to show itself," I said, breathless with anticipation. The shape solidified for a brief moment, revealing a silhouette, tall and shadowy, with indistinct features that sent chills down my spine. I felt a pull, an overwhelming desire to understand this entity that had intruded upon my life. "Why are you here?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "What do you want?" The shape hesitated, and for a moment everything felt suspended in time. Then, as if responding to my question, it surged forward, a wave of darkness crashing against me. I stumbled back, the cold wrapping around me like a shroud, filling my lungs with dread. "Clara!" Sarah shouted, panic erupting in her voice as she pulled me back. In that instant, I felt a rush of emotions, fear, anger, sorrow, all swirling around me. It was as if the creature was trying to convey something, to share a story lost in the depths of its existence. But before I could grasp what it wanted, the weight of its presence intensified, threatening to consume me. "Let's go. Now!" Sarah cried, tugging at my arm, urgency bleeding into her voice. With a final desperate glance at the dark shape, I turned and fled with Sarah, racing out of the kitchen and back into the living room. The door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the silence like a death knell. Outside, the night air was refreshing, but the chill of the encounter lingered. I gasped for breath, my heart racing as I turned to Sarah, who looked equally shaken. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, panic creeping in again. "But I think it wants something. We have to figure out what." But deep inside, a chilling thought echoed relentlessly. What if it didn't just want to be understood? What if it wanted something darker? We stood outside my house, breathing heavily as we tried to collect ourselves. The familiar warmth of the night air felt strangely foreign now, tainted by the shadowy encounter. I glanced back at my home, its dark windows staring like hollow eyes, watching us. "Clara, we can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice edged with panic. "This is getting out of hand." "We can't run away either," I insisted, my mind racing. "I need to know what it wants. If I don't confront it now, it will only get worse." "But what if it's dangerous?" Sarah argued, her eyes wide with fear. "I mean, it just tried to communicate with you in a really terrifying way." "Exactly. It's trying to tell me something." "I have to figure it out," I replied, my voice firm even as uncertainty clawed at my insides. "Okay," she relented, but the fear was still palpable in her gaze. "But we need a plan." I nodded, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on my shoulders. "Let's go back inside, but this time we'll be prepared. I have some sage and a few crystals that my mom used to use for protection. They might help." With our hearts pounding, we made our way back to the house. I could feel the air grow thicker with every step, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for us to enter again. I fumbled for the doorknob, the metal cold and unyielding. "Are you ready?" I asked Sarah, who nodded, albeit hesitantly. As we stepped inside, I lit a candle, its flame flickering in the dim light. The atmosphere felt charged, alive with an unseen energy. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "Let's do this," I said, feeling a surge of determination. We moved back into the kitchen, the shattered plates still littering the floor like remnants of a forgotten battle. I set the sage on the counter and began to light it, the smoke curling into the air, filling the space with a sweet, earthy scent. "Clara, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously at the doorway. "Trust me," I replied, closing my eyes as I took a moment to center myself. "I need to communicate with it." As I waved the smoke around the room, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like a warm embrace. I took a deep breath, letting the scent fill my lungs, hoping it would clear my mind. "If you are here, please show yourself," I called out, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I want to understand. I want to help you." Silence stretched out before us, the shadows lingering at the edges of the room. But then, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy again, and I felt the familiar chill creep back in. The shape appeared again, more defined this time, hovering just beyond the threshold of the kitchen. My heart raced, a mix of fear and intrigue flooding my senses. "Please, I want to know why you're here," I said, the smoke from the sage swirling around me. "What do you want?" The figure wavered, its edges flickering like a faulty light bulb. I could feel the energy intensifying, a surge of emotion radiating from it. In that moment, I was flooded with a torrent of feelings, grief, despair, and something that felt like longing. The shape seemed to pulsate, and I took a step closer, driven by instinct I couldn't quite explain. "You're not here to hurt me, are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. A faint whisper broke through the silence, echoing in my mind. "Help me." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I exchanged a glance with Sarah, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart racing. She nodded, fear etched on her face. "It's asking for help. Clara, this is getting too real. What do you need help with?" I pressed, feeling an inexplicable connection to the entity. In response, the shape swirled closer, and I felt a rush of cold air, as if it were trying to envelop me. I fought the urge to recoil, holding my ground. "I want to help you," I said firmly. "But I need you to show me what you want." The air around us shifted again, growing darker, the shadows stretching ominously. I could sense an urgency in the entity's presence, as if it were desperately trying to communicate something lost in the depths of its despair. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the room filled with a cacophony of whispers, all blending into one chaotic sound. "Clara, get back!" Sarah shouted, panic rising in her voice. I turned to see the kitchen door swing shut on its own, a powerful gust of wind whipping through the room. I felt a surge of terror as the shadows around us deepened, and the entity surged forward, taking on more solid form. "Clara!" Sarah screamed, pulling at my arm, trying to drag me back toward the front door. No, I can't leave, I shouted, straining against her grip. I need to know. The shape loomed before us, an amalgamation of darkness and sorrow, its form shifting like smoke. I felt its presence wrap around me, and suddenly, images flooded my mind, flashes of a life once lived, moments of joy twisted with despair, a longing that resonated deep within me. Please, tell me what you want, I cried, my voice breaking as I fought against the overwhelming sensations. A vision flashed through my mind, a glimpse of a family, laughter echoing through the halls of my house. Then, darkness consumed them, leaving only the haunting emptiness behind. As the images faded, I stumbled back, realization crashing over me like a wave. You were never able to let go, I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. You're trapped in this place. The entity recoiled slightly, the flickering shadows dimming. I could sense its pain, the weight of its sorrow heavy in the air. Is that why you're here? I continued, my heart aching for this lost soul. You need to move on? You need to be free? A quiet, desperate whisper filled the space around us. Free. Before I could react, the room erupted into chaos. The lights flickered violently, and the air grew cold, filled with an anguished cry. Shadows swirled around us, and I felt the overwhelming pressure of the entity's desperation pressing down on me. Clara, we have to go, Sarah shouted, her eyes wide with terror. But I couldn't move. I was anchored by the weight of the entity's sorrow, pulled into its despair. Wait. I can help you, I cried out, desperate to reach this lost soul. Suddenly, the room fell silent. The oppressive shadows receded, and I felt the weight lift, a momentary peace washing over us. The entity stood before me, more solid than ever, its form flickering with uncertainty. Let go, I urged, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. You don't have to suffer anymore. You can move on. For a brief moment, I saw something shift in the entity's form, a glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness. But just as quickly, the shadows surged back, enveloping it once more, and I felt the cold grip of fear wrap around me again. No. Please, I shouted, desperation rising in my throat. You can be free. Just let go. But the shadows writhed violently, and I felt the entity's anguish erupting around me. It surged forward, a whirlwind of emotion and despair. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart racing. Clara, let's go, Sarah screamed, fear radiating from her. As I turned to flee, the last thing I saw was the entity's face, a distorted reflection of pain and longing, eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to pierce through the darkness. We burst through the front door, gasping for breath, the cold night air hitting our faces like a splash of ice water. I staggered back, my heart racing as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. What was that? Sarah panted, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know, I replied, my voice shaky. But I think it's trapped here. It's been waiting for something, or someone. What do you mean? She asked, glancing nervously back at the house. It needs to be freed, I said, my heart heavy with the weight of the encounter. But I don't know how. As I stared at my home, the realization settled over me like a shroud. This was not just a haunting, it was a plea for help, a cry from a soul lost in the void, trapped in the shadows of its past. And I had to find a way to set it free. The air felt electric as we stood outside my house, still reeling from the chaotic encounter inside. The realization that I was intertwined with the fate of a lost soul weighed heavily on me. Sarah was shaking beside me, her breath coming in quick bursts as she looked at me, wide-eyed with fear. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper. "I have to go back in," I replied, my resolve strengthening. "I can't leave it like this. It needs me, and I can't just turn my back on it." "No, Clara," Sarah exclaimed, grabbing my arm. "You can't go back in there. It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous for it to stay trapped," I insisted, shaking off her grip. "I have to try." The moon hung high in the night sky, casting a ghostly glow over everything. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear that coursed through me. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, the shadows lurking behind every corner, but I knew I couldn't turn away. "Stay here," I said to Sarah, my voice firm. "If I'm not back in 30 minutes, call for help." She hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Please, Clara, be careful." "I will," I promised, turning back toward the door. Each step felt like I was walking toward a precipice, the dark abyss of the unknown. I took hold of the doorknob, its metal cold against my skin, and pushed it open. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The flickering candlelight danced across the walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. I stepped inside, heart racing, and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing ominously in the silence. "Show yourself," I called out, my voice steady despite the tremor in my heart. "I'm here to help you." For a moment, the only sound was the distant creaking of the house settling, but then, the air grew colder, and the familiar figure materialized, flickering at the edge of my vision. I felt a rush of emotion surge through me, fear, sorrow, and an overwhelming need to understand. "Please, I know you're suffering," I said, taking a step closer. "I want to help you. Just tell me what I need to do." The entity hovered, its form shifting like mist. I could sense its confusion, the turmoil within it growing more intense. It flickered, the shadows twisting around it as if they were alive, pulsating with its pain. "Let go of your pain," I urged, feeling a warmth rise within me, a spark of hope. "You don't have to carry this burden anymore. You can be free." The entity surged forward, the shadows billowing around it like storm clouds. I stood my ground, determined to face whatever it was experiencing. "I can feel your pain. I know you've lost something, someone. But holding onto it won't bring them back." Suddenly, the air filled with a deafening silence, followed by a low, mournful wail that resonated through the room, echoing against the walls. I felt it vibrate in my bones, a chilling sound that clawed at my heart. "Let me help you," I cried out, my voice breaking as I fought against the rising tide of despair that threatened to overwhelm me. "What do you need? Please, tell me." A vision flashed before my eyes, fragments of memories that unfolded like a story lost in time. I saw a young girl laughing, her face radiant with joy, then a sudden shift to darkness, her laughter turning into a terrified scream. My heart sank as I realized that the entity was a mother searching for her lost child. "Is it your daughter?" I gasped, piecing together the fragments of its pain. "Is she the one you're searching for?" The entity surged closer, its form twisting and writhing, shadows deepening around it. I could feel its anguish radiating from it, a palpable energy that pulled at my very soul. "You're not alone," I said, reaching out toward it. "I want to help you find her. You have to let go of the pain. You have to trust me." The entity flickered again, the shadows swirling violently, and I felt a rush of cold air as if a storm had swept through the room. "Please," I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "I can't help you if you don't let me in." Suddenly, the wailing intensified, filling the air with a haunting melody of grief. I took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of courage I had. "I'm here for you. Let me be your voice. Let me help you find peace." The shadows flickered, and for a moment I felt a connection, an understanding that transcended the fear. I closed my eyes, focusing on the warmth within me, the flicker of hope that I could ignite in this dark place. "Think of your daughter," I urged, my voice low and steady. "Think of the love you have for her. Let that love guide you to freedom." The wailing began to subside, the shadows softening around the entity. I could feel its presence shifting, almost as if it were trying to break free from the chains that bound it. "Let her go," I whispered. "She's waiting for you, and she wants you to be at peace." The entity flickered again, and I felt a rush of energy surge through me, a wave of emotion that crashed against my heart. In that moment, I knew I had to take a leap of faith. With trembling hands, I reached out further, connecting with the swirling shadows. "I'm here for you," I said firmly. "Together, we can find her. You can let go of this pain." As I spoke, the shadows began to retract, drawing away from the entity, revealing its true form, a woman with sorrowful eyes, her face lined with grief. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but I felt the urgency behind it. "I will," I promised, tears streaming down my cheeks. "Let me help you find her." The room darkened again, the air crackling with tension as the entity surged forward, the shadows swirling around us like a tempest. I felt the energy pulsing, pushing against me, but I held my ground, my heart beating fiercely in my chest. "Let her go," I cried, my voice rising above the chaos. "You can be free. You can be with her again." The shadows roared around us, a cacophony of anguish and longing. I closed my eyes, envisioning a warm light, a beacon of hope that could cut through the darkness. "Follow the light," I urged. "It will guide you home." Slowly, the shadows began to fade, retreating like a tide pulling back from the shore. I felt the energy shifting, a warmth enveloping me as the entity's form began to solidify, the anguish in its eyes softening. "Let go," I whispered, tears flowing freely now. "You are not alone." In a final surge of energy, the entity surged forward, and I felt a rush of emotion wash over me, a tidal wave of grief, love, and longing. "Thank you," the woman's voice echoed in my mind, and then the shadows dissolved completely, revealing a soft, radiant light that enveloped the room. I gasped as the light expanded, filling the space with warmth and serenity. The house trembled around me, and I felt the weight of the darkness lift, as if a heavy burden had been released. For a moment, I was surrounded by a profound stillness, a deep peace settling over me. The memories of the woman's daughter flooded my mind, a little girl with bright eyes and laughter that danced like sunlight. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light began to fade, and the room returned to its familiar shadows. But the oppressive energy was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and closure. As I stood there, breathing heavily, I felt a warmth in my chest, a flicker of hope that whispered through the silence. "You're free," I said softly, my voice filled with emotion. "You can finally rest." I turned to leave, the sense of finality settling around me like a comforting embrace. As I stepped outside, the night air felt different, lighter, as if the world had shifted in a profound way. Sarah rushed to my side, her eyes wide with concern. "Clara, what happened? Are you okay?" I nodded, wiping the tears from my cheeks. I helped her. "She's finally free." We stood there for a moment, the weight of the night settling over us, the darkness now merely a shadow of what it had been. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, the lingering fear replaced by an overwhelming gratitude. "Let's get out of here," I said, glancing back at the house one last time. "It's time to move on." As we walked away, I could feel the warmth of the night surrounding us, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest places, there is always a flicker of light waiting to break through. And I knew that no matter how invisible the creatures of our fears may be, facing them head-on can lead us to the freedom we all seek. The chase for the shadow. Have you ever felt that creeping sensation of being watched? That feeling as if something or someone hides just beyond your vision, hovering in your blind spots? It began so subtly that, at first, I didn't even notice. A misplaced item here, a creak there, things that could easily be dismissed as the workings of an overactive mind or the inevitable quirks of an old apartment. The night I realized something was truly wrong, I had been preparing for bed, absorbed in my nightly ritual. I had just closed the bathroom door behind me when a shadow crossed the mirror. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was as if a figure had swept through the reflection, a mere blur, gone as quickly as it appeared. I blinked, trying to catch it again, to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but there was only my own startled face staring back at me. "Just tired," I muttered to myself, but my pulse pounded faster, each beat amplifying an irrational sense of dread. I hadn't felt anything quite like it before, a chill that didn't reach my skin but clawed right at my mind. I didn't sleep that night, convinced I'd see that shadow again, convinced that it hadn't been a figment of my imagination. The next morning, I scoured my apartment, checking the windows, locks, every closet and crevice, looking for something, anything out of place. Nothing. Everything seemed untouched, as it always had been, as though my nightly terrors were indeed nothing but products of an exhausted mind. But that evening, as I sat in my living room, the silence around me felt unnatural. My nerves tightened as I realized it wasn't just silence, it was a deafening emptiness. A kind of absence I'd never felt in my own space, as if even the sound of my own breathing dared not interrupt it. And then I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniable, the sound of footsteps just outside my door. I sat, paralyzed, straining to listen, every fiber of my being on edge. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but no one knocked. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling, and walked slowly to the door. The hallway was empty, dark and cold, as if nothing had passed through it in ages. I shut the door firmly, my heartbeat throbbing in my ears. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that my space, my sanctuary, had been somehow invaded. I was never fully at ease. Every small noise startled me, every creak felt like an intrusion. Then, a few nights later, as I lay half awake, a sensation washed over me, both familiar and new, the feeling of being watched. A feeling I hadn't had since childhood nightmares, but this was somehow worse, raw and invasive, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I wanted to move, to turn on the light, to reassure myself that I was alone, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey. Trapped in what felt like an eternity of paralysis, I heard a faint whisper, close, as if just next to my ear, though the words were indiscernible. The sound chilled me to my bones, my mind screaming against the helplessness, demanding my limbs to move, to escape this unseen presence. After what felt like hours, my body finally broke free from the paralysis. I lurched out of bed, gasping, my heart hammering. The room was still, empty, every object in its rightful place, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching, waiting. It was only the beginning. The days that followed were descent into constant, silent dread. During daylight hours, I could almost convince myself it was all a string of bad dreams about a paranoia brought on by stress or exhaustion. But every time dusk settled, an unease gnawed at my senses, gnawing away the thin veneer of rationality I'd clung to during the day. I started to notice smaller things, each one chipping away at my resolve. The ticking of my kitchen clock seemed louder, erratic even, as if counting down to something I couldn't see. My keys went missing, only to reappear in strange places, like the bathroom sink or beneath my bed. It was like someone was toying with me, watching me stumble around, floundering to make sense of these inexplicable disturbances. One night, after hours of tossing and turning, I decided to go for a late walk. The cool air might calm me, I thought. I left the apartment around midnight, my hands shoved deep into my pockets as I paced the empty streets. The world outside was still, but somehow I felt even more exposed, as though the darkness itself was stretching to observe my every movement. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd catch sight of a figure trailing me. But there was nothing. Only shadows shifting under the dim streetlights. When I finally returned, exhausted, I climbed the stairs to my floor, relief flooding over me as I reached my door. I took out my key, but it wouldn't fit. Fumbling in the dim light, I examined it, only to realize that it wasn't my key at all. My own house key had changed, becoming an unfamiliar shape in my hand. How could that be? Suddenly, a chilling thought crossed my mind. Someone had switched it. I'd left my keys on the table by the door before going out, hadn't I? The realization hit me like a jolt. Someone had been inside while I was out. I leaned my head against the door, trying to steady myself. My breathing was shallow, my heart racing so fast it felt as though it might burst. This was no longer a matter of shadows or imagined noises. This was real, tangible, and utterly terrifying. After finally managing to unlock the door with my spare key, I stepped inside cautiously. Everything seemed in place, yet the silence was almost tangible, like a blanket pressing down on me. The air felt heavy, charged with something dark and oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone, that someone or something had been here in my absence. In a half-dazed state, I wandered through each room, flicking on lights and checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing seemed disturbed, and yet I felt a strange certainty that something had been watching me. I turned, catching my reflection in the hallway mirror. My eyes stared back, but they seemed distant, almost hollow. I looked away, a shiver running down my spine. That night, I slept with the lights on, but even the soft glow couldn't drive away the sensation of something lingering just beyond my sight, watching, waiting. The whispering returned, faint and fleeting, words slipping through my consciousness like smoke. I could never quite make them out, but their presence was undeniable. They seeped into my dreams, leaving a trail of dark memories in their wake. In the following days, my routine became erratic. Every time I left the apartment, I double-checked the locks, then returned moments later to check them again. And still, the feeling of intrusion lingered. Friends noticed my distraction, asking if I was all right, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. How could I explain a threat that I couldn't see, that I could barely even comprehend myself? Soon, I stopped going out altogether, trying to convince myself that I was safer at home. But it was a hollow reassurance. Every night, the shadows felt closer, the silence more hostile, and the whispering louder, almost like a distorted lullaby that only I could hear. In the middle of one particularly restless night, I found myself drawn back to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection felt off, the face staring back at me somehow more foreign. The eyes were mine, yet they bore an unsettling emptiness, a vacancy that sent a tremor through my body. I leaned in closer, squinting at the details, and as I did, the lights flickered. For just a split second, in the dim light, I thought I saw something standing behind me. My scream was involuntary, a raw release of the fear that had been building for days. I stumbled back, my heart thudding painfully, but when I looked again, there was only my reflection. Shaken, I scrambled to turn on every light in the apartment, feeling an urgent need to dispel any darkness. The shadows receded, but the terror lingered, settling into my bones. I knew, somehow, that this wasn't the end, only the beginning of something much darker. The weeks passed, yet sleep became a rare luxury. I'd spend my nights curled up on the couch, every lamp blazing, the TV buzzing faintly in the background to drown out the silence. My thoughts raced endlessly, haunted by memories of that figure behind me, the one I'd glimpsed only for a split second. But that split second had changed everything. I knew it hadn't been a figment of my imagination. Someone, or something, was watching me. I began keeping notes, hoping that recording each incident would give me clarity. Lights flickered. Saw shadow in mirror. Keys went missing. Each entry looked harmless on its own, but together they formed an unsettling pattern, proof of an unseen visitor haunting my life. Still, part of me wanted to believe I was overreacting. But then, things escalated. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed a faint, wet handprint on my bedroom window. The kind that's left when fingers press against cold glass. I lived on the 5th floor, and my window hadn't been opened in weeks. My heart pounded as I leaned closer. The print was smeared, as though it had been hastily wiped away, but not entirely. Tracing the outline with my finger, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was larger than my hand, the fingers slightly longer, almost skeletal. Someone, or something, had been there, leaving behind a mark as silent proof of its presence. Every fiber of my being wanted to flee, to leave everything behind and never look back. But where would I go? I couldn't explain this to anyone, and even if I did, who would believe me? So I stayed, even as the boundaries of my own apartment felt tighter, as if closing in on me. The walls that once provided comfort now seemed to close in, like a trap I'd unwittingly fallen into. I started hearing things. During the early hours of the morning, a faint humming would echo from the hallway, soft but unmistakable, the tune slow and unsettling, like a lullaby sung just out of tune. I'd strain my ears, trying to catch the melody, but it would fade whenever I got close. Every attempt to find this source ended in the same result, silence. The humming haunted me, slipping into my mind even while I was awake, filling my thoughts with that eerie tune. One evening, desperate for a change of scenery, I invited my friend Amelia over. We hadn't seen each other in weeks, and I hoped that her presence might ease the tension that had taken root in my apartment. She arrived, her laughter and energy briefly breaking through the gloom that had settled over my life. I felt almost normal again as we chatted over coffee, the familiar comfort of her presence grounding me. But as the evening wore on, I saw her glancing over her shoulder, her smile faltering. I didn't need to ask to know what was wrong. She felt it too, the oppressive weight of the air, the unnatural silence lurking between our words. "Is everything all right here?" she asked eventually, her voice low, as though afraid to disturb something. I forced a smile. Just a bit of an old building's charm, I guess. Creaks and groans at night. She nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. After a few hours, she excused herself, clearly unsettled. As I closed the door behind her, I felt more alone than ever. Her visit had only confirmed what I'd feared. I wasn't imagining this. The darkness within these walls wasn't just in my head. That night, I woke to a new horror. The apartment was utterly silent, a thick, oppressive quiet that made the faintest noise feel intrusive. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, every muscle tensed, waiting. My ears strained for any sound, but there was only silence. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart. Then, I felt it, a faint brush against my arm. My eyes snapped open, but the room was empty. My skin prickled, every nerve screaming that I wasn't alone. I clutched the covers, willing myself to stay still, to listen, but the feeling of something unseen lingered, hovering just beyond my sight. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, as if carried on a distant breeze, the words too soft to discern. But they grew louder, filling the room with a chilling cadence, phrases overlapping, echoing in a way that made my stomach twist with dread. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, cold, detached, like a voice from another time, another place. I covered my ears, but the whispers persisted, seeping into my mind. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing them to stop, my breathing shallow and quick, but they continued, relentless, pushing me to the edge of panic. When they finally faded, the silence felt heavier, an ominous reminder that whatever haunted me was growing bolder. I barely slept after that, the whispers replaying in my mind, their unintelligible words somehow laced with meaning that I couldn't grasp. Over the next few days, I spiraled deeper into paranoia, every shadow and sound sending jolts of fear through me. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there. The apartment itself seemed to transform, each room taking on a darker, colder hue as though it were slowly being drained of life. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit kitchen, I felt that overwhelming urge to check the locks again. I walked to the door, sliding each bolt, turning each knob, ensuring they were secure. And then, as I turned to step away, I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on the other side of the door. My blood ran cold. Every rational thought fled as I stood there, paralyzed. The knock came again, louder this time, its echo filling the silence like a dark promise. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my breath caught in my throat. I was alone, there was no one else in the building at this hour, and no reason anyone would be visiting. And yet, something stood on the other side. The knocking stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I could feel it waiting, a presence lurking just beyond the door, as if it knew I was there, frozen in terror. The air grew colder, the walls seeming to pulse with an unseen life, the entire apartment filled with an energy that pressed in from every side. I backed away slowly, unable to take my eyes off the door. For what felt like hours, I stood in the middle of the room, afraid to make a sound, terrified of what might happen if I did. Eventually, I crept back to my bed, pulling the covers over myself like a child, hoping the thin fabric might protect me from whatever was out there. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it found its way in. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and fear. I barely left the apartment, afraid of what might greet me upon my return. Shadows grew sharper, sounds louder, and every creak and groan of the old building seemed to pulse with dark intent. It was as if my life had been split in two, before, when everything made sense, and now, when reality itself had shifted into something twisted and hostile. One evening, desperate for any sense of control, I set up a camera in my hallway. I thought that if I could just capture something, a shadow, a movement, I might finally have proof of what was happening to me. I placed the camera on a shelf, angling it toward the hallway mirror, the very spot where I'd seen that figure weeks before. The red recording light blinked in the dark as I pressed record and went to bed, half dreading, half hoping for answers. That night, sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that familiar weight, a sensation of something pressing down on me, a heaviness that was almost suffocating. Hours later, I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, images of shadows and whispers flickering in my mind. I woke just before dawn, chilled to the bone, with a dread settling over me. For a few minutes, I couldn't bring myself to check the recording. What if I found something? Or worse, what if I found nothing, and the nightmares continued without explanation? Finally, I gathered the courage to press play. At first, the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. The hallway stood empty, the mirror reflecting only the dim light of the living room. I fast-forwarded, my finger trembling slightly on the button. And then, at exactly 3:30 in the morning, something shifted. A faint movement in the mirror, just a flicker at first, then sharper. A shadow began to form, a dark figure materializing behind my own reflection, tall and indistinct, as if woven from smoke. It stood perfectly still, almost blending into the darkness, but I could make out vague features, elongated limbs, a face obscured in shadows. And then, slowly, it turned. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, an absence where features should have been, hollow and dark, a blank space that seemed to pull at my very soul. I froze, a chill crawling up my spine. The figure lingered there, watching, until, in a sudden, fluid motion, it reached a hand forward, pressing its long, thin fingers against the surface of the mirror. My breath hitched. The touch seemed to reverberate, sending ripples across the glass, as though it was reaching out for me, trying to breach the barrier that separated us. I paused the video, my hand shaking, bile rising in my throat. The realization struck me like a blow. It wasn't merely watching me from the shadows. It was trying to cross over. I shut off the camera, my mind reeling, and slumped against the wall, my heart pounding in my ears. What was happening to me? My world had unraveled, replaced by this waking nightmare. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything that might break the invisible chains binding me to this horror, but I felt utterly trapped. The walls that once sheltered me were now a prison. In the days that followed, I grew increasingly desperate. Every attempt to leave the apartment ended in failure, as though some invisible force held me back. The few friends who knew of my situation urged me to get help, to talk to someone, but how could I explain something that seemed to defy reason? Every word felt inadequate, every explanation hollow. Then, one night, I awoke to find that all the lights were off. I'd left them on, every single one, but now, the apartment was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my bedside lamp, my fingers slipping over the switch. When it finally clicked, the light flickered weakly, casting a feeble glow that barely pushed back the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. Across the room, standing just within the edge of the light, was the shadowy figure from the mirror. It was closer now, its form more distinct, its limbs stretched in unnatural angles. It seemed to pulse, as if it were part of the darkness itself, alive and shifting. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze on me, a cold, consuming stare that filled me with a dread deeper than anything I'd ever known. For a moment, I was paralyzed, locked in place by an invisible force. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey, as though it, too, was trapped in this nightmare. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow, deliberate, and agonizingly silent. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in the oppressive silence. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Its arm lifted, pointing one long, skeletal finger at me, as if marking me, claiming me as its own. My body finally jolted into action. I scrambled back, knocking over a chair in my panic, my eyes locked on that finger, that silent, damning gesture. In a desperate bid to escape, I fled into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, waiting, expecting to hear it pounding against the wood, trying to force its way inside. But there was only silence. I stood there, trembling, my mind racing. After what felt like hours, I gathered the courage to crack open the door, peering out into the darkness. The figure was gone, the room empty, as if it had never been there. And yet, I could feel it, an imprint left on my mind, a scar from which I knew I'd never fully recover. I couldn't keep living like this. That much was clear. But I didn't know where to go, who to turn to. My home had become a nightmare, and I was its prisoner, haunted by a presence that seemed intent on claiming me, on dragging me into its world. It was then that I remembered something Amelia had once told me about a small, out-of-the-way bookstore run by a man with a reputation for knowing things that most people preferred not to believe in. With nowhere else to turn, I made my decision. If anyone could help, it had to be him. The next morning, I left the apartment for the first time in days, the bright morning sunlight almost blinding after the darkness that had swallowed my life. I clutched my bag tightly, feeling vulnerable out in the open, glancing over my shoulder with every step. The world outside felt oddly distant, as if it was no longer real to me, just a backdrop to the horror that clung to me like a second skin. The bookshop was exactly where Amelia had described, tucked between two old brick buildings, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. Its sign was faded, the letters barely legible, and the dusty windows seemed to shroud whatever lay inside. A bell above the door chimed as I stepped in, its sound hollow, echoing strangely in the quiet space. The shop smelled of old paper and candle wax, a mixture of scents that might have felt comforting under other circumstances. But here, in this forgotten place, it felt like stepping into another world, one where reality blurred and the rules I knew no longer applied. Bookshelves stretched up to the ceiling, filled with volumes that looked as old as time itself, their titles obscured by dust and age. The only light came from dimly flickering lamps, casting elongated shadows across the floor. "Can I help you?" I jumped, startled, and turned to see a man standing behind the counter. He was older, with sharp, watchful eyes and an expression that held equal parts curiosity and weariness. His gaze was intense, as though he could see straight into me, reading everything I tried so desperately to hide. I think something's following me," I managed, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Something I can't see. It's in my apartment, it's watching me." The man nodded slowly, as though he'd heard it all before. Without a word, he reached under the counter, pulling out a small, leather-bound book and laying it in front of me. Its cover was plain, unmarked, but something about it felt heavy, charged with a strange energy. He gestured for me to open it. I hesitated, then lifted the cover, revealing yellowed pages filled with dense handwriting, written in an ink that seemed to shift colors in the light. Symbols I didn't recognize filled the margins, each line curling into shapes that seemed almost alive. The text was in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow I felt its meaning deep in my bones. "It's an ancient book," the man explained, his voice low. "About things that live in the spaces between our world and others. He looked at me carefully. They are drawn to fear, to the darkness that lingers in the human mind. Once they find someone, they rarely let go. They feed on that fear, becoming stronger with each passing day. My heart pounded as his words sank in. So, there's no way to get rid of it? He studied me for a moment before speaking again. There are ways. But they require a sacrifice, something precious, something you're willing to give up to sever its connection to you. The thought made my stomach turn. I had little left to give, little that hadn't already been stripped from me by the relentless presence that haunted me. But I couldn't keep living like this. I nodded, my resolve hardening. The man's expression softened, as if he understood the weight of my decision. He pointed to a specific passage in the book, his finger tracing over a symbol that looked like an eye. Tonight, before midnight, read these words aloud in the presence of a mirror. But be careful. It will try to stop you, to distract you. You mustn't look away, no matter what happens. I left the bookshop with the book clutched tightly in my hands, its weight both comforting and ominous. That night, I sat in front of the old mirror in my living room, the book open on my lap, my reflection staring back at me with eyes that looked haunted, almost hollow. I took a deep breath and began reading. The words were harsh, almost painful to speak, as though they carried a weight that made my mouth ache with every syllable. My voice wavered, but I forced myself to continue, my eyes locked on my reflection. At first, nothing happened. The room was silent, save for my voice echoing against the walls. But then, the air grew colder, thickening around me, pressing in like a tangible force. Shadows began to gather at the edges of the room, moving slowly, creeping forward with a life of their own. I could feel it watching me, its presence growing stronger, as though it knew I was trying to break free. My heart raced, but I kept reading, the words tumbling from my lips in a desperate chant. Suddenly, a whisper echoed from behind me, soft and familiar. "Why are you doing this?" it asked, the voice almost pleading, as though it belonged to someone I'd once known. I forced myself to ignore it, but the voice persisted, each word digging into my mind like a knife. "Please," it said again, closer this time. "Don't leave me. Don't you remember?" Tears pricked my eyes as memories surged forward, memories of moments I hadn't thought of in years, images of faces long forgotten. It felt as though my own mind was turning against me, trying to pull me back, to drown me in a flood of doubts and regrets. I could feel my focus slipping, the shadows creeping closer, but I kept my gaze fixed on the mirror, my voice steady. Then, something in the mirror shifted. My reflection was still there, but it wasn't me anymore. Its eyes were darker, hollow, filled with an ancient malice that sent a chill through my entire body. It smiled, a slow, sinister smile that seemed to twist its face into something inhuman, something monstrous. The shadow behind me moved, its outline sharpening, becoming clearer with each second. It reached out, its fingers brushing the edge of the mirror, its face a void, empty yet somehow filled with a terrifying hunger. My own reflection mirrored the creature's movements, as if the two were in sync, both reaching out, trying to pull me into their world. The voice in my head grew louder, a cacophony of whispers and screams, each one laced with desperation and anger. I clenched my fists, focusing on the words, pouring every ounce of strength into each syllable. The mirror began to vibrate, the surface rippling like water, and I felt the creature's presence weaken, its form beginning to blur. But just as I thought I might break free, a hand shot out from the mirror, cold and skeletal, grabbing my wrist with a grip that felt like ice. I gasped, the air leaving my lungs in a painful rush, as it pulled, dragging me toward the mirror's surface. Its face loomed closer, the darkness within its eyes consuming everything, a void that seemed to reach into my very soul. "No!" I screamed, wrenching my arm back, my voice breaking as I uttered the final words of the chant. The shadow's grip loosened, its form flickering, and with one last, furious scream, it was gone, dissolving into the air like smoke. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking. The room was silent, the oppressive weight lifted, but I felt hollow, drained, as though the creature had taken a part of me with it. I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see its face staring back at me, but there was only my reflection, pale and shaken, my eyes wide with lingering terror. For a moment, I thought it was over. I could feel the air around me lightening, the shadows receding, the darkness finally loosening its grip on my life. But as I looked closer, I saw something else, a faint outline in the glass, just barely visible, as though it was waiting, biding its time, watching from the depths of the mirror. I backed away slowly, the realization settling over me like a cold shroud. It wasn't gone. Not really. It was just waiting for me to make one last mistake. After that night, I was never truly alone. Even as I left the mirror behind, refusing to glance at it again, I felt its presence lingering, haunting the edges of my mind. Days bled into nights, and sleep became an elusive, fragile thing. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt that dark void hovering just beyond the veil of my dreams, an unseen watcher, waiting. I tried to go about my life as best as I could, but the world felt different, warped. Every reflective surface seemed to hold a faint, dark smudge, a fleeting image that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on it. Even strangers on the street seemed distant, almost ghostly. I felt severed from reality, like I was no longer a part of the world I'd known. One evening, desperate to escape the suffocating stillness of my apartment, I decided to take a walk. The city streets were quieter than usual, the air thick with an eerie calm. As I wandered aimlessly, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of being watched, I found myself drawn to a park nearby, a place I hadn't visited in years, not since my childhood. The park was almost deserted, save for a few people scattered on benches, shadows in the dimming twilight. I walked to an old fountain in the center, the water still and dark. The fountain was surrounded by a circle of overgrown trees, their twisted branches arching over it like fingers reaching for the sky. As I looked into the water, I felt that same pull, a magnetism that seemed to draw me in deeper and deeper until I couldn't look away. The surface of the water shimmered, rippling with faint movement, and then, slowly, a reflection took shape. But it wasn't me. It was the figure from the mirror, its hollow eyes staring up at me, in endless, consuming darkness. It was clearer than ever, almost solid, as though it had crossed a threshold, stepping closer to my world. I tore my gaze away, heart pounding, but as I turned to leave, I saw it again, not in the fountain, but standing at the edge of the trees, watching me from the shadows. My skin prickled, and I felt a cold sweat break over me. It was closer, more real, more here than it had ever been before. And then it moved, stepping forward, its footsteps silent but heavy, like each step pressed against the fabric of reality itself. I stumbled back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed with terror. It kept coming, inch by inch, its face a blank, endless void that seemed to draw everything around it into darkness. In a last, desperate act, I whispered the words from the bookshop, the ancient chant that had once held it at bay. My voice was weak, but I repeated the words, clutching onto them as my only shield. The figure paused, just for a moment, but this time it didn't fade. Instead, it tilted its head, almost as if mocking me, as if it had grown stronger, immune to the words that once contained it. Realizing I was out of options, I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty park. I could feel it behind me, its presence pressing down on me, filling the air with a thick, suffocating dread. I ran without looking back, my lungs burning, my legs weak, every instinct screaming at me to keep moving, to stay ahead of the darkness that was closing in. But it was no use. I could feel it catching up, its shadow stretching over me, pulling me back with an invisible force. I stumbled and fell, my hands scraping against the rough ground, and as I looked up, there it was, looming over me, blocking out the sky, its face leaning closer, closer, until I could feel its cold, empty breath. I closed my eyes, every fiber of my being bracing for the inevitable. But instead of consuming me, it spoke, a voice like the hollow echo of 1,000 whispers, empty yet piercing. "You cannot escape," it said, each word dripping with finality. "You belong to me." And then, in one fluid motion, it reached out, pressing its fingers against my forehead. A flood of images filled my mind, memories, thoughts, fears, all twisting and contorting, as though it was sifting through them, marking each one. I felt myself slipping, a part of me fading, as though it was peeling away pieces of my soul, claiming them for itself. In those final moments, I understood the truth. It wasn't just a presence haunting me. It was an entity, a force older than time, something beyond human comprehension. And now, I was bound to it, a thread woven into its endless darkness. When I finally opened my eyes, the world around me looked the same, but everything felt different. The park was empty, the fountain still, and I was alone. Yet, in my mind, I could feel it, a shadow lurking in the depths, a constant reminder of what I had seen, of what I had become. The figure was gone, but its mark remained, imprinted in my thoughts, my memories, a part of me now and forever. I left the park that night, knowing I would never be free. My life would go on, but it would be a hollow existence, one haunted by the shadow that had claimed me, that would linger in every reflection, every dark corner, waiting. And in that silence, I knew it was only a matter of time before it would return. Life after that night felt like an endless dream, and not the kind that fades with dawn's light. It was as if my existence had been split, fractured by the events that had unfolded in that park. I went through the motions of daily life, but everything felt detached, empty. I still held conversations, went to work, and even managed to keep up appearances with friends, but a part of me remained frozen in that dark space, in the chill of the park's shadows, the silent void of the mirror, and the suffocating presence that had left its mark deep in my mind. No one noticed the difference in me. Maybe that was the most unsettling part of it all, how seamlessly I fit back into the world, despite the internal transformation that had left me haunted. Days passed, but I knew that I was different. I could feel it every time I looked into a mirror, the way my reflection seemed off. There was a glimmer in my eyes that hadn't been there before, something faint but undeniable. And then came the whispers. They started as faint murmurs, like a distant conversation heard through walls. I would hear them late at night, just as I was drifting to sleep, the quiet syllables curling around my mind like smoke. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the residue of trauma echoing through my thoughts. But each night, the voices grew stronger, becoming clearer, until I could make out distinct words, phrases. "You belong to me." I couldn't sleep. Each night, as the darkness filled my apartment, the whispers returned, growing louder, filling every corner. I tried everything, music, white noise, even sleeping pills, but nothing silenced them. They seemed to come from inside me, a quiet litany that reminded me of the entity's grip on my life. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, I reached out to Amelia, the friend who had first recommended the bookshop. I hadn't seen her in weeks, my isolation growing as the darkness took hold, but I needed to know if she had ever felt the same, if there was any escape from this silent torment. When she arrived, I could see the concern in her eyes as she took in my appearance. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice hesitant, as if afraid of the answer. "I don't think so," I replied, my voice hollow. I think it's still here. I feel it in every shadow, in every mirror. It's like it's waiting." Amelia looked away, biting her lip. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this," she said quietly. She reached into her bag, pulling out another small, ancient book, its leather cover worn and faded. She handed it to me, her hand shaking slightly. "There's one last thing you can try. It's not a guarantee, but it's the only chance you have left." The book felt cold in my hands, the weight of it unnatural, as if it carried something alive within its pages. Amelia wouldn't meet my gaze, and her silence filled me with dread. "What's in here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's a binding ritual," she replied. "Something that will seal it away, if it works. But it requires a final sacrifice." My heart sank. I had sacrificed so much already, my peace, my sanity, every shred of the person I'd once been. But if this was my last chance, I had no choice. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I opened the book. The pages were covered in dense writing, symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, an ancient language that felt both foreign and familiar. The instructions were simple, and yet I could feel the weight of their implications. The final line was clear, unmistakable. "The ritual requires a piece of yourself, an offering to bind the shadow. Once bound, it will be sealed within the mirror, never to leave." I knew what I had to do. I stood before the mirror, the same one that had been with me from the start, its surface gleaming with a dark luster that seemed almost alive. I could feel it watching me from the other side, the shadow, waiting, knowing what was coming. Slowly, I began the ritual, chanting the words from the book. The air grew thick, heavy, and I could feel the darkness gathering, pressing in from all sides, filling the room. My vision blurred, and my reflection began to shift, morphing into something unrecognizable. I could see its face now, fully formed, hollow eyes, a mouth twisted into a mocking smile, its hands reaching toward me through the glass. As the final line left my lips, the mirror pulsed with energy, its surface rippling like water. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging on something deep within, a part of me that I knew I would never get back. I stumbled, feeling an emptiness spread through my chest, a void where something vital had once been. With one last, desperate effort, I finished the ritual, sealing the entity within the mirror. The glass went still, the darkness retreating, leaving only my reflection staring back at me, pale and hollow. I could feel the absence, the piece of myself that I had given up, the final sacrifice that bound the entity forever. I was alone. The presence was gone, the whispers silenced. But as I looked into the mirror, I knew that something fundamental had changed. The emptiness within me was a reminder of what I had given, what I had lost. And as I stared into my own eyes, I realized that I was no longer the person I had been. The shadow had taken more than I ever realized, leaving me with an ache that would never heal. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.